Picture this, Rome, in all its glory. The sun glints off marble temples, the roar of the crowd echoes from the colossal arena, and legions march along roads that stretch to the very edges of the known world. This is an empire at its zenith, a civilization of unimaginable power and sophistication. For centuries, the story of Rome has been defined by two grand acts: its magnificent rise and its dramatic, earth-shattering fall. We've been told a tale of barbarians at the gates, of decadent emperors, of a single catastrophic collapse that plunged Europe into a dark age. It's a powerful, almost mythical narrative of ruin that has echoed through the halls of history for over 1,000 years. But what if that story, the one we all think we know, is wrong? What if the fall of Rome wasn't a fall at all, but something far more complex, something we've fundamentally misunderstood? The idea of Rome's fall is so deeply ingrained in us that we rarely stop to question it. It feels like a historical fact, as solid and unchangeable as the ancient stones of the Forum. We envision a clean break, a before and after, a moment when the light of civilization was snuffed out. But history is rarely so simple, and the story of Rome's transformation is perhaps the greatest testament to that complexity. The truth is far more fascinating, far more human, and it's a truth that has been hiding in plain sight, obscured by centuries of myth and oversimplification. This isn't just about revising dates or arguing over emperors. It's about re-examining one of the foundational events of Western civilization and discovering a narrative of resilience and reinvention that challenges everything we thought we knew. So we invite you to join us on a journey to unravel this ancient mystery. We're going to look beyond the crumbling statues and the familiar tales of decline, to explore the vibrant, tumultuous, and astonishingly resilient world that emerged from what we call the fall. We'll uncover the hidden forces, economic, social, and cultural, that were at work, and reveal how the Roman world didn't just vanish, but transformed, its essence flowing into new kingdoms and cultures, shaping the world we live in today. This is a story not of an ending, but of a profound and lasting metamorphosis. If you're ready to see one of history's greatest dramas in a completely new light, then let's begin. To understand the real story, we first need to dismantle one of the most enduring images from history books: the relentless tide of savage barbarian hordes smashing through Rome's defenses, burning cities, and extinguishing civilization in an orgy of destruction. This powerful, almost cinematic vision is compelling, but it's a profound oversimplification that obscures a much more nuanced reality. The term invasion itself is misleading, conjuring images of a unified foreign army with a single destructive goal. The truth is, what we often label as invasions were frequently complex movements of people, mass migrations, often desperate, sparked by factors like climate shifts, pressure from other groups like the Huns pushing from the east, and the search for land and security within the perceived stability of the Roman world. These weren't always armies of conquest. They were often entire communities, men, women, and children on the move, seeking a place to settle and live. For generations, the line between Roman and barbarian had been blurring. Germanic warriors weren't strangers to the empire. They had been serving in the Roman legions for centuries, often rising to high ranks. Some of Rome's most formidable military leaders, and even emperors, had barbarian ancestry. These tribes were not outside observers of Roman culture. They were deeply embedded within its military and political fabric. They admired Roman law, infrastructure, and organization. So when groups like the Visigoths or the Vandals moved into Roman territory, their leaders weren't aiming to wipe the Romans' slate clean. More often than not, they sought formal recognition and a place within the Roman system. They negotiated treaties, known as fodera, with the Roman authorities, agreeing to settle in specific areas in exchange for military service. They were given land and, in return, pledged to defend the empire. In many ways, these were not invasions, but a form of outsourcing, a way for a stretched, thin Roman administration to secure its borders with the very people who had once been perceived as the threat. Consider the famous sack of Rome in the year 410 by the Visigoths under Alaric. This event sent shockwaves across the ancient world, but it was not the act of mindless vandalism we often imagine. Alaric was a former Roman military commander. His demand was not for the destruction of the city, but for a permanent homeland for his people within the imperial structure. He besieged the city not to erase it, but to force the emperor to negotiate a better settlement deal. When his troops finally entered Rome, they did plunder its wealth, but they largely spared the churches and important buildings, and they left after just 3 days. This was a targeted political act by a leader who wanted to become a part of Rome, not its destroyer. Across the empire, from Gaul to North Africa, we see a similar pattern. Barbarian kings like Theodoric, the Ostrogoth in Italy, ruled over Roman populations, proudly upholding Roman law, minting coins with the emperor's image, and preserving classical literature. They saw themselves as the inheritors and protectors of Roman civilization, not its grave diggers. The fall of Rome was less a violent murder by an outside force, and more a gradual, complex transformation, a merging of worlds where Roman institutions slowly evolved, adopting new influences from the people who had come to stay, laying the groundwork for the medieval kingdoms that would follow. So if the barbarians weren't simply destroying Rome, what forces were truly at work beneath the surface? To find the answer, we need to look beyond the battlefield and into the ledger books. The Roman Empire built one of the most sophisticated and interconnected economies the world would see for over 1,000 years. Its lifeblood was trade, flowing along roads and sea lanes from the tin mines of Britain to the spice markets of India. This wasn't a primitive system. It was a vast, complex machine. But this very sophistication contained the seeds of a slow-burning crisis, a series of economic pressures that would fundamentally reshape the empire from the inside out. For centuries, the engine of this economy had been conquest. Each new province brought an influx of enslaved people, precious metals, and new lands to tax. It was a massive, continuous stimulus package. Think of it like a company whose primary business model is constantly acquiring new competitors and absorbing their assets. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the era of easy conquest was over. The empire had reached its logistical limits, bordered by oceans, deserts, and formidable enemies like the Persians. The economy had to shift from a conquest-based model to a maintenance-based model. Now the colossal state, with its enormous professional army, its vast bureaucracy, and its expensive mega projects, like the walls and fortifications you see on screen, had to be funded not from new plunder, but purely from internal taxation. The tax burden on citizens, particularly the land-owning class, became immense and increasingly unpopular, creating deep social friction. This strain was compounded by a creeping decentralization. The unified Mediterranean trade network, once the empire's greatest strength, began to fragment, as political instability made long-distance travel riskier, and as currency problems disrupted commerce, regions started to become more economically self-sufficient. Gaul began producing its own pottery instead of importing it from Italy. Spain supplied its own grain. On one hand, this looks like a decline, the end of a unified economic zone. But from another perspective, this was a necessary adaptation. these regional economies were becoming more resilient, less vulnerable to a shock in one part of the empire. They were learning to stand on their own, a crucial development for the post-Roman world. Then there was the monetary system. We often hear about rampant inflation ruining Rome, but the story is more nuanced than just prices going up. The Roman currency, the denarius, was originally high-quality silver. But to fund its massive expenses without raising taxes even higher, the state began to debase the coinage, reducing the silver content over time. This was essentially a hidden tax, and it led to soaring prices. The famous Edict of Diocletian in the year 301, which you can see here, was a desperate attempt to freeze prices across the empire. A clear sign the government was losing control of its own currency. The response wasn't collapse, but innovation. People began to revert to barter for local trade, and the government eventually started demanding taxes in kind in grain, cloth, and other goods, because the coinage was no longer trusted. This wasn't the end of the economy. It was its transformation into something different, something less centralized and more localized. The economic world of Rome didn't vanish in a single crash. It slowly and unevenly broke apart, like a continental plate shifting, creating new economic landscapes that, while smaller and simpler, were the foundations upon which the medieval world would be built. Of course, a key reason we cling to this idea of a clean and catastrophic fall is because of one man and one monumental book, published in 1776. That man was Edward Gibbon, and his work was The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's difficult to overstate Gibbon's influence. For generations, his sweeping narrative didn't just describe the fall of Rome. For many, it defined it. But to truly understand our modern myth, we have to step into Gibbon's world, because his perspective was powerfully shaped by the intellectual currents of his own time, the 18th century Enlightenment. Gibbon and his contemporaries championed reason, secularism, and civic virtue. They looked back at the classical world of Greece and Rome as a golden age of philosophy, logic, and republican government. From this vantage point, Gibbon traced what he saw as a long, tragic departure from those classical ideals. His central thesis pointed to two primary culprits for the empire's demise. The first was what he termed barbarism and religion. For Gibbon, the rise of Christianity was a transformative, and in his view, a deeply destructive force. He argued that this new faith shifted the focus of the Roman citizen from the terrestrial to the celestial, from active participation in the civic life of the state to a passive hope for salvation in the next world. He believed Christianity sapped the traditional Roman martial spirit and civic virtue that had built the empire. His famous and rather acerbic description of monasticism, the tedious, uniform, solitary penance, exemplifies his view that this new worldview encouraged a withdrawal from public duty. The second culprit was internal moral decay. Gibbon painted a vivid picture of the late Roman elite as corrupt, decadent, and soft, more interested in luxurious living and palace intrigues than in the stern, self-sacrificing duty of their ancestors. In his telling, the empire didn't just fall from external pressure. It rotted from within, having lost the very moral character that had made it great. It's a compelling story, one that has resonated for centuries, but it's crucial to recognize that Gibbon was not a neutral observer. He was a product of his era, and his history is as much a commentary on the Europe of his day as it is on ancient Rome. His critique of the Christian Church was also a veiled critique of the powerful, institutionalized churches of 18th century Europe, which he and other Enlightenment thinkers saw as superstitious and oppressive. His laments about lost civic virtue were echoes of the political debates happening in his own time. Furthermore, Gibbon's narrative overwhelmingly focused on the Western Roman Empire and its political collapse. He paid far less attention to the Eastern Roman Empire, what we often call the Byzantine Empire, which continued to thrive for another 1,000 years with its capital in Constantinople. By framing the story as a decline and fall, he created a powerful, dramatic arc that was immensely satisfying from a literary standpoint, but it was a simplification. He established a framework that subsequent historians would spend centuries either reinforcing or trying to dismantle. For a long time, Gibbon's shadow loomed large. 19th and early 20th century, historians often worked within his basic paradigm, sometimes adding their own biases, framing the fall as a cautionary tale about racial purity or the dangers of immigration. However, the 20th century saw a major shift. With new archaeological techniques and a more global perspective, historians began to challenge Gibbon's foundation. Archaeology, for instance, revealed that many barbarian settlements showed remarkable continuity with Roman life, not a sharp break. Economic historians pointed to the complex systemic pressures we discussed earlier, showing that the empire's financial structures were transforming long before any single political event. Today, most scholars don't talk about a fall in Gibbon's dramatic sense, but rather a transformation, a transition, or a restructuring. The narrative has moved from a story of death to one of metamorphosis. Yet, despite all this academic progress, Gibbon's powerful and poetic version of events remains the one that captures the public imagination, proving just how deeply a well-told story, shaped by its own time and place, can embed itself in our view of the past. This brings us to a point that fundamentally shatters the traditional narrative. The Roman Empire didn't actually end in the year 476. While the last emperor in the West was deposed in that iconic year, the Roman Empire itself, in its other, wealthier half, continued to thrive for nearly a millennium more. We have to stop thinking of Rome as a single entity and start seeing it as what it had become: a vast, complex state with two administrative capitals. The real power center had been shifting east for centuries, and the city of Constantinople, the new Rome, became the impregnable heart of an empire we now call Byzantine, but which its citizens simply and steadfastly referred to as the Roman Empire. This wasn't a successor state or a copy. This was Rome, carrying an unbroken line of emperors, an unbroken legal system, and an unbroken cultural identity straight through the so-called Dark Ages and into the Renaissance. To grasp the sheer scale of this continuity, we need to look at the reign of one of its most formidable emperors, Justinian, in the 6th century. His ambition was nothing less than the full restoration of the Roman Empire to its ancient glory, to reclaim the lost western provinces from the barbarian kingdoms that had formed there. Under his brilliant general, Belisarius, Byzantine armies embarked on a series of spectacular reconquests. They swept across North Africa, taking it back from the Vandals. They crossed into Italy in a grueling war against the Ostrogoths, eventually liberating the city of Rome itself. They even secured a foothold in southern Spain. For a brief, dazzling moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. But Justinian's legacy was far more than military. He commissioned a project of monumental importance: the codification of all Roman law. This massive work, the Corpus Juris Civilis, gathered 1,000 years of legal history, edicts, and legal opinions into a coherent, organized system. It wasn't just a preservation of the past. It was a rationalization that would become the bedrock of nearly all modern European legal systems. And towering over his capital was his architectural masterpiece, the Church of Hagia Sophia, a building of such breathtaking scale and engineering genius that its dome seemed to hang from heaven by a golden chain. This was not the work of a dying empire. It was the vibrant expression of a civilization at its creative and administrative peak. Life in the Eastern Roman Empire was, in every meaningful sense, life in the continued Roman world. The people of Constantinople did not think of themselves as Byzantines. That's a term historians invented much later to avoid confusion. They were Romae Romans. They spoke Greek as their common language, a shift that had occurred naturally over time. But they upheld Latin as the language of law and administration for centuries. They were governed by the same principles of Roman law, paid taxes to the Roman state, and were protected by the professional Roman army. The Hippodrome in Constantinople was the direct successor to the Circus Maximus in Rome, where chariot races fueled the same passionate, often violent, factional rivalries between the blues and the green. The sophisticated bureaucracy in Constantinople was a direct evolution of the late Roman administrative system, managing a complex economy that stretched from Britain to China. While cities in the West were contracting, Constantinople remained the largest, wealthiest, and most defensible city in the Christian world. Its massive land walls repelling wave after wave of invaders for over 1,000 years. This enduring Roman identity in the East forces us to completely reframe our perspective on the fall of Rome. If the Roman Empire continued, with its institutions, culture, and unbroken imperial tradition, until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in the year 1453, then what exactly fell in 476? The answer is that only the Western provincial government collapsed. It was a profound political change, certainly, but not the extinction of a civilization. The Eastern Empire acted as a vast repository of classical knowledge, preserving the texts of Plato and Aristotle, the scientific works of Galen, and the historical records that would later be rediscovered in Western Europe, helping to fuel the Renaissance. It was a bulwark that shielded a fragmented Europe for centuries, absorbing the onslaught of Persian and later Arab armies. The story of Rome is not a simple tragedy that ends in the 5th century. It is a story of adaptation and survival, a 1,000-year epilogue written in the East that challenges us to see this ancient civilization not as something that died, but as something that transformed so profoundly, it ultimately required a new name. Now let's turn our attention back to the West. If the Roman Empire continued, vibrant and powerful, in the East for another 1,000 years, what are we to make of the dramatic events that unfolded in places like Italy, Gaul, and Spain? This is where our entire perspective needs to shift. We have been conditioned to see the 5th century in Western Europe as a landscape of ruin, a world of broken aqueducts and abandoned villas, a civilization extinguished. But a closer look reveals a very different picture, one not of destruction, but of profound and continuous transformation. What we witness is not a light being switched off, but a complex process of reinvention, where Roman foundations were not destroyed, but were instead reshaped, adapted, and built upon, slowly evolving into the forms we recognize as medieval. Take the physical landscape, for instance. The iconic image of crumbling Roman roads and decaying cities suggests a complete abandonment. But in reality, these structures didn't vanish. Their purpose and form changed. The great Roman road network remained the primary skeleton of transportation for centuries. Medieval pilgrims, merchants, and kings traveled these very same routes. The roads weren't maintained to Roman imperial standards, of course, but they were far from forgotten. They were the enduring arteries of a new age. The story of the cities is even more telling. It's true that many classical Roman cities, laid out with their grids, forums, and grand public baths, did contract significantly in size and population. The centralized imperial funding that maintained their complex infrastructure, like massive aqueducts, dried up, but they did not become ghost towns. Instead, they transformed. The population often clustered in a more defensible core, frequently around a cathedral or a bishop's palace, which became the new center of urban life and authority. The public spaces of the Roman Forum were gradually built over with smaller, more practical structures. The stone from an abandoned amphitheater might be quarried to build a new town wall or a church. This wasn't vandalism, it was pragmatic reuse. The city lived on, its physical fabric repurposed for a new era, its Roman heart still beating beneath a medieval skin. This continuity is even more striking when we look at the people in power. The old Roman senatorial aristocracy, the landowning elite who had governed the provinces for generations, did not simply pack up and disappear when the last emperor was deposed. They were far too entrenched, too wealthy, and too vital to the functioning of society. What happened was a brilliant and gradual assimilation. A Roman senator in 5th century Gaul, for example, still owned his vast estates. When a group of Franks moved into the region and established a kingdom, it was in this local Roman aristocrat's best interest to make a deal with the new Germanic king. The senator would offer his administrative expertise, his knowledge of law, and his local influence. In return, the new king, who needed someone to help him govern and collect taxes from the Roman population, would grant the senator a position of authority and confirm his land rights. Over a generation or two, this Roman aristocrat's family would intermarry with the new Frankish nobility, blending Roman lineage with Germanic martial prestige. Their Latin would slowly mix with the local Germanic tongue, evolving into early French. The Roman latifundia, the large estate, became the medieval manor. The Roman senator had seamlessly evolved into the medieval feudal lord, and the foundations of his power, land, local authority, and a hereditary title, remained strikingly consistent. This seamless transition extended to the very bedrock of society, law and language. The sophisticated Roman legal system did not evaporate. Instead, the new Germanic rulers, who admired Roman administration, actively preserved it. They issued law codes, like the Salic law of the Franks, or the Visigothic code, which were often a fascinating blend of traditional Germanic customs and core principles of Roman law, especially concerning property and contracts. These weren't primitive replacements. They were legal hybrids, adapting a Chinese letter old system for a new, multicultural reality. And then there is the most powerful legacy of all, one we are using right now: language. Latin never died, it evolved. The vulgar Latin spoken by the common people and soldiers across the Western Empire did not disappear. It slowly, organically, transformed, sound by sound, word by word, into the Romance languages we know today: Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Romanian. Every time someone speaks one of these languages, they are speaking a direct descendant of the Roman tongue. Furthermore, Latin itself remained the language of scholarship, of the Church, and of international diplomacy throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The very words you are hearing now are rooted in that unbroken linguistic tradition. So when we pull back and look at the full picture, the idea of a catastrophic fall becomes impossible to sustain. The political superstructure of the Western Roman Empire did dissolve, but the civilization itself, its roads, its cities, its landowning class, its laws, and its language proved to be incredibly resilient. These elements did not collapse, they metamorphosed. They were adapted and reinterpreted by the new peoples who settled within the old imperial borders, creating a vibrant and entirely new cultural synthesis. The Roman world provided the essential ingredients: the flour, water, and yeast. and the early medieval period kneaded them into a new kind of bread. This was not a dark age that began with a single dramatic event in 476, but a long, slow sunset that gave way to a dawn, one whose light was built from the very substance of the day that had come before. And yet, even after considering the economic pressures, the political transformations, and the complex cultural blending, there remains a powerful, often invisible force that was quietly reshaping the fate of the Roman world. We're now beginning to understand that the empire's destiny was not entirely in the hands of emperors or generals, but was also being written by the very climate itself, and by microscopic pathogens that traveled along its trade routes. Recent scientific breakthroughs, from ice core samples drilled deep in Greenland's glaciers to the analysis of ancient tree rings, are revealing a dramatic environmental backdrop to the story of Rome, a saga of golden ages brought by good weather and catastrophic downturns triggered by natural disasters far beyond any human control. For centuries, the Roman Republic and the early empire flourished during a period scientists now call the Roman climate optimum. This was an era of unusually warm, wet, and stable weather conditions across the Mediterranean world. Think of it as a planetary stroke of good luck that lasted for generations. These ideal conditions meant bountiful harvests year after year. Farmers across Italy, North Africa, and Gaul could reliably produce enormous agricultural surpluses. This abundance was the fundamental fuel for Roman expansion. It fed the massive cities, most notably Rome itself, which swelled to over 1 million inhabitants, a population size that wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years. It provisioned the legions on their long marches, and sustained the vast trade networks that moved wine, olive oil, and grain from one end of the empire to the other. This climatic blessing allowed for a level of economic specialization and population density that became a hallmark of Roman power. The empire, in many ways, was built on a foundation of consistently good harvests. But this golden age of climate did not last forever. Starting around the middle of the 2nd century, the optimum began to wane, giving way to a colder, drier, and much more unpredictable period. This shift alone would have placed stress on the agricultural system, but it was punctuated by a series of cataclysmic events. Ice core records show evidence of colossal volcanic eruptions in the years 536 and 544 CE. These weren't just any eruptions. They were among the most powerful of the last 2,000 years, pumping immense amounts of ash and sulfate aerosols high into the stratosphere. The effect was a planetary sunshade. For years, a dusty veil drifted around the globe, dimming the sun's rays and leading to a dramatic, prolonged cooling. Contemporary chroniclers from Constantinople to Ireland described a sun that shone with the blueness of the moon, and reported summer snowfalls in places that had never seen them. The result was catastrophic crop failure across the entire northern hemisphere. This was not a local famine, but a global climate shock that struck at the very heart of the Roman economic system, its food supply. The state, already straining under the weight of its own bureaucracy and military expenses, now faced a desperate, empire-wide subsistence crisis. Into this world of climatic chaos and food shortages came an even more direct and terrifying killer: pandemic disease. The empire's greatest strength, its interconnected system of roads and sea lanes that linked Britain to the Euphrates, became its greatest vulnerability, creating a superhighway for pathogens. The first major blow was the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, which swept through the empire beginning around 165 CE, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Ancient sources describe cities and army camps devastated, with mortality rates so high that there were not enough people left to bury the dead. Modern historians estimate it may have killed a quarter of the empire's population. A century later, the Cyprian plague struck with similar ferocity. But the most devastating of all, coinciding perfectly with the volcanic winters of the 6th century, was the Justinianic plague. This was the first confirmed outbreak of the bubonic plague in the historical record, the same disease that would later wreak havoc as the Black Death. It arrived in the busy port of Constantinople in the year 542, carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness, left a harrowing account. He described victims suffering from sudden fevers and swollen buboes, with people dying so quickly that the city ran out of space to bury the bodies. Corpses were stacked inside towers and left to rot. At its peak, the plague was killing 10,000 people a day in Constantinople alone. The demographic impact of these repeated pandemics is almost impossible to overstate. We're not talking about a single, tragic event from which a population can recover in a generation. This was a series of catastrophic population collapses, each one striking a society that had not yet fully rebounded from the last. The cumulative effect was a hollowing out of the Roman world. There were simply far fewer people. This led to a critical shortage of both agricultural laborers to work the fields and soldiers to fill the legions. With fewer taxpayers, the state's revenue plummeted at the very moment it needed more resources than ever to respond to the crises. Abandoned farmland became a common sight, reverting to wilderness and breaking the agricultural chain that fed the cities. The Roman army, once a massive, professional force, began to shrink and struggled to recruit, forcing emperors to rely more and more on hired barbarian mercenaries, a decision that would have profound long-term political consequences. These environmental and biological shocks did not single-handedly cause the empire's transformation in the West, but they delivered a series of hammer blows to an already complex and strained system. They dramatically reduced the empire's resilience, its ability to absorb other shocks, whether they were barbarian migrations, political coups, or financial meltdowns. The story of Rome's transformation, therefore, cannot be told solely through treaties and battles. It must also be told through ice cores, tree rings, and the silent, devastating journey of a plague bacterium across a connected world. To truly grasp the military dimension of Rome's transformation, we need to discard the image of legions simply vanishing from the field. The Roman war machine did not suddenly break down. It was meticulously retooled and reinvented over hundreds of years, adapting to new threats and new economic realities in a process of continuous evolution. The story begins with the iconic legion of the early empire, a force of heavily armored citizen soldiers, recruited from within Italy and the Romanized provinces, wielding the short stabbing sword known as the gladius, and moving in disciplined formations. This was an army designed for conquest, for fighting set-piece battles to expand the imperial frontiers. But as those frontiers solidified, becoming permanent borders to be held rather than lines to be pushed forward, the army's role fundamentally changed. It shifted from an offensive spear to a defensive shield, a massive garrison force stretched over thousands of miles. This new mission required a different kind of soldier and a different kind of organization. The first major shift came in the late 3rd century, with the reforms of the emperors Diocletian and Constantine. They recognized that the old legionary system was too slow and too centralized to respond to the multiple, simultaneous crises now erupting along the Rhine, Danube, and in the east. Their solution was a strategic division of the army into two main branches. The first was the limitanae, the frontier troops. Think of these soldiers not as a mobile field army, but as a highly organized border patrol and local militia. They were stationed permanently in fortresses along the rivers, living on and farming the land they were tasked to defend. They were the first line of defense, expected to hold off minor raids and slow down any major incursion. The second, more elite branch was the comitatenses, the field armies. These were the rapid reaction forces, stationed in strategic cities further inside the empire, ready to march to any major breach in the frontier. This new structure sacrificed some of the old legions' sheer offensive power for greater strategic flexibility and resilience. The soldiers' equipment evolved to match this new reality. The heavy segmented plate armor, the lorica segmentata, was gradually phased out in favor of simpler chainmail shirts, which were easier to produce and maintain. The long spatha sword, better suited for cavalry and fighting from a variety of positions, replaced the classic gladius. This was not a decline in quality, but a practical adaptation to the diverse enemies and types of warfare the empire now faced. Perhaps the most significant change, however, was in who was filling the ranks. For centuries, military service had been a path to Roman citizenship and a mark of pride. But as the empire's internal population stagnated, and the tax burden made landowning citizens less inclined to serve, the army faced a chronic recruitment shortage. The state's solution was both pragmatic and transformative. It began to recruit directly from beyond the frontier. Germanic warriors from tribes like the Franks, Goths, and Alemanni were welcomed into the legions. At first, they served as individuals, but increasingly entire tribal groups were brought into the empire under a special treaty status known as foedis. These people, the foederati, were given land to settle within the imperial borders in exchange for a commitment to provide military service to Rome. On the surface, this seemed like a brilliant fix. It secured the empire's borders with the very men who might otherwise be attacking them. And it did so without the massive cost of recruiting, training, and paying a new legion from scratch. The Roman state provided the land, the federated tribes provided the soldiers. This system, however, fundamentally rewired the circuitry of military loyalty. A soldier in the old legions swore his oath, his sacramentum, to the Roman state and the emperor personally. His pay, his pension, and his identity were intrinsically tied to Rome. A Frankish chieftain leading a band of foederati, however, had a different primary loyalty. His allegiance was first and foremost to his own war band, his comitatus. He followed the Roman emperor because it was part of a treaty agreement, and because the emperor paid him in land and prestige, but his warriors followed him, not a distant abstraction of Rome. The Roman army was gradually transforming from a national institution into a collection of privately contracted war bands, led by powerful generals who were often of barbarian origin themselves. Men like Stilicho, a Vandal, and Ricimer, a Suebian, became the true powers behind the throne in the West, commanding Roman armies that were now largely composed of their own federated peoples. The state was, in effect, outsourcing its own defense, and in doing so, it was creating power centers that could rival the imperial court itself. Yet, for all these profound changes, it is crucial to understand that this system worked remarkably well for a very long time. The late Roman army, with its mixed Roman and federated troops, was a highly effective fighting force that secured the empire for over 2 centuries against immense pressure. The foederati were not primitive savages. They were skilled warriors who admired Roman military science and were eager to master it. They fought using Roman tactics, often under Roman officers, and they were integral to some of the empire's greatest late victories. The real transformation became apparent not on the battlefield, but in the treasury. The old system of paying soldiers a regular salary in sound coin and providing a land grant upon retirement had been a massive, but predictable, expense for the state. The new model of paying whole tribes with grants of taxable land had a different long-term consequence. It gradually transferred the very foundation of wealth land out of the direct control of the imperial treasury and into the hands of these new, semi-autonomous military leaders. When the Western imperial government in Ravenna could no longer afford to pay its federated commanders, or was seen as weak, those commanders had little reason to obey. They already had the land, the soldiers, and the local authority. So when a leader like Odoacer decided to depose the last Western emperor in 476, he wasn't destroying a functioning army. He was simply assuming direct command of the military forces that had been defending Italy for generations. The army hadn't collapsed, it had been absorbed, its loyalty successfully transferred from a fading central authority to the new localized powers that would become the kingdoms of medieval Europe. This brings us to one of the most contentious and enduring debates surrounding Rome's transformation: the role of Christianity. For centuries, a persuasive argument has been made that this new faith, by fundamentally redirecting the loyalty and resources of the Roman people, actively contributed to the empire's undoing. Proponents of this view, echoing Edward Gibbon, point to a dramatic shift in priorities. Before Christianity became the state religion, a Roman citizen's primary loyalty was to the state itself. The classical ideal of virtus, civic virtue, military courage, and unwavering dedication to the republic or the emperor was the bedrock of public life. Public funds flowed into roads, aqueducts, and the legions. The ancient pagan religion was deeply intertwined with the state. To honor the gods was to honor Rome. Christianity, with its revolutionary focus on a heavenly kingdom and personal salvation, introduced a powerful alternative allegiance. Critics argue that the immense wealth that began flowing into the church, through donations, the construction of monumental basilicas, and the support of a growing professional clergy, was wealth that was no longer available to the state treasury or the military. Furthermore, the rising influence of pacifistic ideals within certain strands of Christian thought, while not universally adopted, is seen as having softened the traditional Roman martial spirit. The most educated and ambitious men, who might have once sought careers as senators or generals, were now increasingly drawn to the powerful and respected role of bishop or abbot, directing their talents toward ecclesiastical rather than imperial service. From this perspective, Christianity didn't just change Roman religion. It rechanneled the very energy and resources that had built the empire, diverting them inward and upward, away from the earthly walls that defended the city of man. However, this critique only tells one side of a much more complex story. To cast Christianity solely as a corrosive force is to ignore the vital, stabilizing role it played as the old imperial structures began to change. When we look at the 5th and 6th centuries, a period of tremendous political upheaval in the West, we see that the Church often did not withdraw from public affairs, it stepped in to fill the void. As imperial authority receded from provinces like Gaul, Spain, and Italy, it was the bishops who frequently emerged as the de facto leaders of their cities. They organized grain supplies during famines, negotiated with invading Gothic or Frankish kings to spare their populations from slaughter, and used church funds to ransom captives. The extensive charitable works of the Church, from founding hospitals to providing for the poor, created a social safety net that the strained imperial government could no longer reliably maintain. This wasn't a withdrawal from the world. It was a pragmatic and deeply necessary form of civic leadership that provided crucial continuity and order amid chaos. The Christian Church, with its hierarchical, empire-wide organization modeled on Roman provincial administration, became the most robust and enduring institution left standing. Its network of bishops, communicating across what had been the empire, maintained a line of dialogue and a semblance of shared identity long after the last Western emperor was gone. The Church also functioned as a remarkable preservative of Roman culture itself. While some point to religious conflicts and the suppression of pagan practices, the monasteries that spread across Europe became fortresses of knowledge. Within their scriptoriums, monks meticulously copied not only the Bible and theological works, but also the classical texts of Latin literature, philosophy, history, and science. The writings of Virgil, Cicero, and Livy survived the so-called Dark Ages because Christian scribes preserved them. The Church required an educated clergy to administer its sacraments and interpret its doctrine, and in doing so it ensured that the Latin language, the language of Rome, remained a living, written tongue. This preserved the essential tools of law, administration, and scholarship. When a new Germanic king like Clovis the Frank converted to Catholic Christianity, he wasn't just adopting a new god, he was integrating himself and his people into a cultural and administrative system that was still deeply Roman. The Church provided a framework of law, literacy, and bureaucratic practice that these new rulers could adopt, allowing Roman administrative traditions to continue under a new Christian banner. So, did Christianity weaken Rome or sustain it? The most accurate answer is that it did both, but at different times and in different ways. In the 4th century, as the empire was grappling with immense internal and external pressures, the rapid reallocation of societal focus and material wealth toward the Church may have accelerated the weakening of certain traditional state functions. Yet in the 5th and 6th centuries, as the political superstructure of the Western Empire dissolved, that very same Church became the primary vessel carrying forward the legacy of Roman administration, Latin culture, and urban life. It provided the stability that allowed for a managed transition rather than a total collapse. Christianity did not single-handedly cause the fall, nor did it single-handedly prevent it. Instead, it acted as a powerful transformative agent, helping to guide the Roman world through its most profound metamorphosis, ensuring that the light of its civilization, though refracted through a new prism, was never fully extinguished. To fully appreciate the structural pressures that reshaped the Roman Empire, we need to examine one of the most consequential administrative overhauls in its long history: the creation of a formal two-emperor system. The man behind this radical restructuring was the Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in the late 3rd century after a period of such intense internal chaos and civil war. It's known as the crisis of the 3rd century. During this 50-year span, the empire had nearly ripped itself apart, with armies constantly proclaiming their own generals as rival emperors. Diocletian, a pragmatic and formidable organizer, looked at this sprawling, crisis-ridden state and concluded it was simply too big for one man to govern. His brilliant, yet ultimately double-edged, solution was to formally split the empire's administration into two halves: a Western Empire, with its capital initially at Mediolanum, modern-day Milan, and an Eastern Empire, with its capital at Nicomedia, later Constantinople. On the surface, this tetrarchy, or rule of four, was a masterpiece of political engineering. Diocletian appointed a trusted colleague, Maximian, as a co-emperor, or Augustus, to rule the West while he took the East. Then each Augustus selected a junior emperor, a Caesar, to serve as their successor and handle regional defense. The map you see now illustrates this division. This system was designed to provide multiple points of command, ensuring that if the empire was attacked on two fronts, simultaneously, say, by Germanic tribes on the Rhine and the powerful Sasanian Empire in Persia, there would always be an emperor nearby to lead the response. No longer would legions have to march for months from one end of the empire to the other. In its early years, it worked remarkably well. Diocletian and his colleagues crushed internal rebellions, secured the frontiers, and ended the cycle of civil war that had plagued the empire for generations. It was a practical, logical response to the immense logistical challenges of governing a territory stretching from northern Britain to the deserts of Egypt. However, this division, while solving the immediate problem of military management, inadvertently sowed the seeds for a profound and lasting political divergence. The eastern and western halves of the empire were not created equal. Look again at the map. The east was vastly wealthier, more urbanized, and more densely populated. It contained the ancient economic powerhouses of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, regions with centuries-old cities, sophisticated industries, and control over the lucrative Silk Road trade routes. The West, by contrast, was more rural, its economy more dependent on sprawling agricultural estates, and its urban network less dense. While both halves were supposed to support each other, a natural imbalance emerged. The wealthier East could more easily fund its larger, professional army and more complex bureaucracy from its own substantial tax base. The West, with a smaller economic foundation, struggled to maintain its military establishment, making it increasingly reliant on the very system of recruiting barbarian foederati we discussed earlier. This economic disparity meant that when a crisis hit, the two halves did not have the same capacity to absorb the shock. This administrative split also created a powerful centrifugal force in imperial politics. Although the system was designed to foster cooperation, it naturally fostered competition. The idea of a single unified Roman Empire began to erode as the two imperial courts, one in the west and one in the east, developed their own distinct bureaucracies, their own military high commands, and, crucially, their own political priorities. Instead of a single unified policy for the entire empire, you often had two separate strategies. An Eastern emperor, focused on the Persian threat, might be reluctant to send troops and treasure to help his Western colleague fight a war against Gothic tribes in the Balkans. Conversely, a Western emperor might refuse to acknowledge an Eastern decree. This rivalry sometimes erupted into open civil war, as it did after Diocletian's retirement, shattering the very unity his system was meant to preserve. The division hardened over time, especially after Constantine the Great solidified it by building his magnificent new capital, Constantinople, in the east. This city wasn't just a new administrative center. It was a powerful symbol that the empire's heart was now beating strongest in the east, creating a gravitational pull of money, talent, and ambition away from the traditional center in Italy. So, was Diocletian's division a practical solution or a fatal flaw? The answer is that it was both, a necessary adaptation that came with a long-term cost. In the short term, it absolutely saved the empire from immediate collapse by providing the military and administrative stability needed to end the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a realistic acknowledgement that the classical, unified empire of the past could no longer be managed from a single point, but by institutionalizing two separate power centers, it made the eventual political separation of East and West almost inevitable. The system worked well under strong, cooperative rulers, but it created a structural vulnerability when weak or rivalrous emperors held power. The Western Empire, perpetually the poorer and more vulnerable sibling, was left in a precarious position. It lacked the deep internal resources of the East, and as the imperial court in Ravenna grew weaker, the powerful Germanic generals within its own army and the regional aristocracy saw less and less reason to prop it up. The division didn't cause the Western Empire's political dissolution, but it created the framework within which that dissolution could occur, allowing the Eastern Empire to continue on its own, separate, and remarkably enduring path, while the West transformed into something new. This process of transformation extended far beyond politics and military structures, reaching deep into the very way history itself was recorded and remembered. As Christianity became the dominant cultural and intellectual force, it began to act as a filter through which the story of the late Roman world was passed down to us. We must confront a crucial and often overlooked reality. Our written window into this period is overwhelmingly a Christian one. Monasteries and scriptoriums, the very institutions that preserved classical knowledge, were primarily concerned with copying texts that aligned with their faith and worldview. This had a profound consequence: the systematic marginalization, and in many cases the outright silencing, of pagan voices. Imagine trying to understand a complex legal case by only hearing the testimony of one side. That is, in a sense, the challenge we face when piecing together the final centuries of Roman paganism. The vibrant, diverse, and deeply rooted pagan perspectives that had defined Roman civilization for a millennium were increasingly pushed to the edges of the historical record, often portrayed through the critical and sometimes hostile lens of their Christian opponents. Christian authors, many of whom were powerful bishops and theologians, had a clear theological and political agenda. Their writings were not neutral histories. They were arguments meant to demonstrate the triumph of the true faith over what they viewed as demonic superstition. In their accounts, pagan rituals were often described not as the sincere devotions of millions of Romans, but as empty, corrupt, or even sinister practices. The great philosopher Emperor Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate for his attempt to restore paganism in the mid-4th century, is a perfect example. In Christian histories, he is frequently depicted as a foolish and misguided figure, his efforts doomed by divine providence. His own writings, which would have given us his sophisticated philosophical justification for his beliefs, survive only in fragments, often quoted by his Christian critics, solely to be refuted. Similarly, the final, desperate stand of paganism at the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394, where the forces of the pagan usurper Eugenius were defeated by the Christian Emperor Theodosius, was celebrated in Christian chronicles as a clear sign of God's favor. The hopes, fears, and motivations of the pagan soldiers and senators who fought that day are largely lost to us, drowned out by the victorious narrative of the new state religion. This is where the silent testimony of archaeology becomes our most powerful tool for correction. The material evidence dug from the earth often tells a story that starkly contradicts the simplified narrative of a rapid and total Christian triumph found in the texts. For instance, written accounts from the late 4th and early 5th centuries might lead you to believe that pagan temples were immediately and universally closed or converted into churches. But the archaeological record reveals a much messier, more gradual, and more interesting process. In many cities across the empire, we find evidence that grand pagan temples like the Serapeum in Alexandria or the Temple of Apollo in Delphi were not instantly destroyed. Instead, they were often simply closed and left to decay slowly. Their statues and artworks, sometimes carefully defaced or buried by later Christian inhabitants, as you can see in this image of a statue with its nose and hands broken off. In rural areas, pagan shrines and local cults persisted for centuries, their practices subtly blending with those of the new faith. Amulets and household altars dedicated to old gods like Jupiter or local nymphs continue to appear in archaeological layers dated well into the 6th and 7th centuries, showing that the common people were much slower to abandon their traditional beliefs than the elite Christian authors would have us believe. We can see this divergence between text and artifact clearly when we look at the Roman Senate itself. Written sources, like the sermons of influential bishops, portray the Senate in Rome as having been thoroughly Christianized by the late 4th century. Yet, when archaeologists uncovered the remains of the Senate house in the Roman Forum, they made a stunning discovery. Beneath the floor, they found the intact, secret shrine known as the Caecilium. This was a sacred space where senators performed traditional pagan rites before conducting their official business. The most remarkable find was a statue of the goddess Victory, which had stood there for centuries as a symbol of Rome's eternal power. Christian writers recorded fierce debates over its removal, but the archaeology confirms it remained in place, venerated by pagan traditionalists in the Senate, for decades after the empire had officially become Christian. The physical space itself contradicts the written claim of a complete and sudden conversion, revealing a long, lingering twilight for the old gods within the very heart of Roman political power. So, what are we to make of these conflicting sources? The key is to stop seeing the Christianization of the Roman world as a simple switch being flipped, and to start viewing it as a long, complex, and often contradictory cultural negotiation. The written accounts, penned by the ultimate victors, give us one perspective, a top-down view of theological triumph and institutional change. The silent artifacts give us another, a bottom-up view of gradual adaptation, local resistance, and enduring tradition. A beautiful gold glass medallion from the 4th century might show a portrait of a husband and wife, but engraved beside them are both a Christian Cairo symbol and a dedication to the pagan god Apollo. This single object speaks volumes about a society in transition, where individuals could hold overlapping identities and allegiances, not yet forced into the rigid categories that later historians would impose. By listening to both the loud, confident voices in the texts and the quiet, stubborn testimony of the artifacts, we can begin to hear the full, rich, and complicated chorus of the late Roman world. A chorus where the pagan voices, though often muffled, were never completely silenced. If you were to walk through a major Roman city in its heyday, say the great northern capital of Tyre in the late 3rd century, you would be immersed in an environment designed to proclaim the power and benevolence of a universal empire. Imagine wide, colonnaded streets paved with stone, leading you past bustling marketplaces, grand public baths echoing with the sounds of conversation, and a massive amphitheater for gladiatorial games. At the city's heart lay the spacious Forum, an open square surrounded by temples, and a towering basilica where merchants and politicians conducted their business. This was the classical ideal of urban life: open, public, and confident, funded by the state to showcase Roman civilization at its most magnificent. The city was a statement in marble and mortar, a promise of order, culture, and security to all who lived within its walls. But if you were to walk through that very same city just 2 or 3 centuries later, the landscape would be almost unrecognizable, transformed into something both smaller and more defensible, a precursor to the medieval towns of the future. This transformation is the physical embodiment of Rome's metamorphosis. It's a story we've often misread. We look at the crumbling ruins of an abandoned amphitheater or a silted-up aqueduct and see only decline and failure. But the evidence on the ground tells a far more fascinating story of resilience and pragmatic adaptation. The classical city did not simply die. It contracted, fortified, and reinvented itself for a new era of localized power and persistent insecurity. The driving force behind this change was a fundamental shift in priority. The immense wealth and administrative focus that had once been poured into maintaining lavish public amenities like baths and theaters was now urgently redirected toward a single, overriding concern: survival. As the imperial treasury strained and long-distance trade became riskier, the centralized funding for urban infrastructure dried up. Simultaneously, the political instability of the 4th and 5th centuries made cities tantalizing targets for raiders and ambitious warlords. The response wasn't to abandon urban life, but to make it sustainable and defensible with the resources available. Let's take a closer look at Trier, one of the best preserved examples of this process. In the 3rd century, as you can see in this reconstruction, Trier was a sprawling open city. Its grid of streets extending far beyond what would become its new, much smaller core. It boasted the largest Roman bath complex north of the Alps, a colossal structure that required a dedicated aqueduct and a small army of stokers to heat. But by the 5th century, maintaining such a luxury was impossible. The baths fell into disuse, and the city's footprint shrank dramatically. The population withdrew behind a new, much stronger circuit of walls, built not around the entire old city, but around a fortified citadel centered on the imperial palace complex. The stone for these new walls didn't come from distant quarries. It was systematically quarried from the city's own now redundant monuments. The massive amphitheater, located outside the new defensive perimeter, became a literal quarry. Its cut stones hauled away to fortify the new urban core. This wasn't an act of vandalism. It was brilliant urban recycling. The city was cannibalizing its own past to secure its future, transforming a symbol of leisure into the raw materials for its own defense. A similar story unfolds in southern Gaul, in the vibrant city of Arles. Situated on the Rhone River, Arles was a major port and a key administrative center. Its classical layout featured a sprawling circus for chariot races, a theater and a forum, all servicing a large, dispersed population. But as you can see in this later map, the city underwent a profound spatial reorganization. The vast, indefensible perimeter of the classical era was abandoned. The new heart of Arles became a tightly packed warren of streets, clustered around a fortified hill, dominated by its cathedral and the palace of the local bishop. The great Roman circus, located on the city's outskirts, was largely dismantled. Its stone blocks were repurposed to build not only the new city walls, but also the foundations of churches and houses within the safe enclosure. The open spaces of the old forum were built over with more practical, densely packed structures. The focal point of urban life shifted decisively from the secular space of the forum to the spiritual and administrative center of the cathedral complex. The bishop, not a distant imperial official, was now the man who organized the city's grain supply, negotiated with its Visigothic rulers, and coordinated its defense. This pattern repeated itself across the Western Empire, from Spain to Britain. The transformation followed a clear, logical sequence. First, the city's perimeter shrank to a defensible size, often using rivers or high ground as natural barriers. Next, the most robust surviving Roman structures, like an old temple podium or a section of an imperial palace, were incorporated into the new fortifications. Then, the urban population concentrated within this secured area. Life became more vertically oriented, with multi-story buildings replacing sprawling single-level domus. And crucially, the new center of gravity was almost always the Christian cathedral. The bishop emerged as the key figure in this new urban reality. He commanded moral authority, controlled significant church lands and wealth, and could mobilize the population. When the imperial tax collector stopped coming, and the Roman garrison marched away for the last time, it was the bishop who stepped into the power vacuum, ensuring that the city continued to function as an administrative, economic, and social unit. So, the next time you see the ruins of a Roman city, try to look past the broken columns and see the living organism it became. The transition from the open classical city to the fortified medieval town was not a tragic fall from grace. It was a remarkable act of societal triage, Faced with a new world of localized threats and decentralized economies, the people of the late Roman world made a series of tough, practical choices. They sacrificed grandeur for security, public spectacle for communal survival. They traded the sprawling bath complex for a sturdy wall that could protect their families and their livelihoods. In doing so, they ensured that the concept of the city itself, that cornerstone of Roman civilization, did not disappear from Western Europe. It was preserved, repackaged, and handed down, providing the essential urban seeds from which the great cities of the Middle Ages and the modern world would eventually grow. The stone they reused to build their walls was the very stone of their past, ensuring that Rome itself, in a new and resilient form, would endure. And so we arrive at one of history's most iconic bookmarks, the year 476. It's the date etched into our collective memory as the moment the Roman Empire fell. The dramatic final scene where a boy emperor with the ironically grand name of Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. It's a powerful, almost poetic, close to 1,000-year story. But what if this entire dramatic episode was less a conclusive finale and more of a political formality? The final administrative tweak in a process of transformation that had been underway for generations. The truth behind this symbolic moment reveals just how deeply the myth of a clean break obscures a much more complex and continuous reality. To understand the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, we must first strip away the drama and see him for what he truly was, a puppet. He was a teenager, placed on the throne not by the Roman Senate or the people, but by his own father, a powerful Roman general of barbarian origin named Hordes. This was the culmination of a trend that had been building for nearly a century. The Western imperial office had been weakening for decades, its authority steadily eroding as real military power shifted into the hands of the generals who commanded the armies, men who were increasingly of Germanic descent. Look at this timeline of Western emperors in the 5th century. See how many of them were installed, manipulated, and often murdered by these powerful military strongmen, figures like Reshaped, who became known as the Shadow Emperor. The emperor in Ravenna was often just a figurehead, a necessary piece of political theater to legitimize the rule of the man who truly controlled the troops. Romulus Augustulus was simply the last in this long line of pawns, a boy who never truly ruled, and whose name was barely recorded in the official chronicles of the Eastern Empire. His reign was so insignificant that many contemporary historians didn't even consider it worth noting. The man who ended this charade, Odoacer, was himself a product of this deeply integrated, late Roman military world. He was not a savage chieftain fresh from the forests of Germania. He was a seasoned commander who had risen through the ranks of the Roman army. His soldiers were a mix of Germanic tribesmen, Heli, Siri, and Rugii, but they were not an invading foreign force. They were the foederati, the very federated troops the empire had relied upon for its defense for generations. Their grievance was not with Rome itself, but with the specific terms of their service. Hordes, the father of the puppet emperor, had promised them land in Italy as payment for their support, but then reneged on the deal. So Odoacer's men rebelled, not against the idea of Rome, but against a commander who had failed to uphold his bargain. They defeated and killed Hordes, and with the real power behind the throne gone, the boy emperor became entirely irrelevant. There was no great battle for the soul of civilization. It was a military pay dispute that escalated into a change of management. So what did Odoacer do after he deposed Romulus Augustulus? He did something that speaks volumes about the true nature of this fall. He did not declare himself Emperor of the West. He did not burn Ravenna to the ground or proclaim the end of Rome. Instead, he performed a carefully choreographed act of political theater. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robe, the scepter to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, Zeno. In his accompanying message, Odoacer stated that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. He acknowledged Zeno as the sole legitimate Roman emperor and requested that Zeno formally grant him the title of patrician, a high Roman honor, and the authority to govern the Diocese of Italy on the emperor's behalf. This portrait of Odoacer, likely minted on his own coins, shows him not in Germanic garb, but in the profile of a Roman official, his image projecting continuity, not rupture. He was, in essence, asking to be recognized as the Roman governor of Italy, ruling in the name of the legitimate emperor in the East. And Zeno, the Eastern emperor, essentially agreed to this fiction, though with a dose of political maneuvering of his own. He couldn't officially approve the deposition of a fellow Roman emperor, so he gave Odoacer a somewhat ambiguous blessing, telling him he should accept the authority of the legitimate Western emperor in exile, Julius Nepos, who was still alive in Dalmatia. But with Nepos having no real power, this was a face-saving formality. In practice, Odoacer was now the ruler of Italy, governing from Ravenna, and he did so for the next 17 years. He maintained the entire Roman administrative apparatus. The Roman Senate continued to meet in Rome. Roman law remained in force. The consulship, that most ancient of Roman offices, continued to be appointed. Odoacer even distributed land to his soldiers, not as an act of conquest, but through a recognized legal process of land allocation, a practice with deep Roman precedents. Life for the average person in Italy changed very little. The aqueducts still functioned, the taxes were still collected by Roman officials, and the cultural life of the cities continued. The political fall of 476 was, for most people, a non-event. This is the crucial, overlooked reality that shatters the traditional narrative. The Western Roman Empire didn't so much fall as it was formally reabsorbed. The separate, parallel imperial office in the West, which had been a political and military liability for decades, was simply retired. The fiction of a unified empire, which Diocletian's system had already fractured, was finally and officially updated. The Eastern Emperor in Constantinople was now the sole emperor, and Odoacer, and later the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, were his regional governors in Italy, whether they always obeyed him or not. The idea of Rome did not die in 476. Its political structure was streamlined. The story of Romulus Augustulus is not the story of an empire's death, but the story of its final administrative simplification. The moment the long-standing political reality, that the West was already being run by powerful generals, was finally made official. The boy who was named after the mythic founder of Rome and its first emperor didn't preside over an end, but over the last, quiet act in a long, slow transformation. Thinking about the grand structures and political events, it's easy to overlook the most profound legacy of all: the world of ideas that Rome bequeathed to the future. The most resilient elements of Roman civilization weren't its marble temples or its imperial bureaucracy, but the intangible foundations of its culture, its language, its laws, and its literary and philosophical traditions. These did not crumble with the walls of Ravenna. Instead, they demonstrated a breathtaking capacity for reinvention, weaving themselves so deeply into the fabric of the new medieval world that they became invisible, like the skeleton beneath the skin of a new civilization. Let's start with the language itself. Latin never died. It simply did what all living languages do over centuries. It evolved. The formal literary Latin of Cicero and Virgil, which we think of as classical Latin, had always been somewhat distinct from the everyday speech of the common people, the soldiers, and the merchants across the empire. This vulgar Latin, from the word vulgaris meaning common, was the true linguistic engine of the Roman world. As the political unity of the West dissolved and populations became more regionalized, this spoken Latin began to drift and diversify. In the isolation of different valleys and provinces, pronunciations shifted, local slang and grammatical structures from pre-Roman languages blended in. And over time, these dialects grew so far apart, they became mutually unintelligible. From this slow, organic process, the Romance languages were born. The Latin spoken in Gaul, influenced by the Celtic Gaulish language, gradually transformed into what we now call Old French. The Latin of the Iberian Peninsula, absorbing some elements from local languages and from the Visigoths who settled there, evolved into Spanish and Portuguese. In Italy, it became the various Italian dialects, and in the far-off province of Dacia, it remarkably survived to become Romanian. Every single time someone today says ama in Spanish, amor in French, or amore in Italian, they are speaking a direct, unbroken descendant of the Latin word ama. The Roman tongue did not fall silent. It simply learned new songs. Beyond the spoken word, Latin's second life was as the language of power, intellect, and faith. Even as the vernacular languages diverged, the written form of Latin remained the indispensable language of administration, diplomacy, and scholarship throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. When a Frankish king like Charlemagne wanted to legitimize his rule and revive learning, he did so by promoting Latin. All international treaties, royal charters, and church documents were composed in Latin. It was the language of the university, the law court, and the monastery. This created a truly international intellectual community. A scholar from England could travel to Italy or Poland and converse with his peers in a common tongue. The survival of Latin as a living, written language ensured that the tools of complex thought, bureaucracy, and cross-cultural communication developed by Rome were never lost to Europe. It provided a continuous thread of literacy and administrative practice that bound the fragmented post-Roman world together. Parallel to the story of language is the equally impressive saga of Roman law. The sophisticated legal system that had governed a complex, multi-ethnic empire did not vanish into the ether with the last Western emperor. The Germanic tribes who established new kingdoms encountered a population that was still deeply Roman in its customs and its expectations of justice. These new rulers, far from rejecting this system, actively sought to use it. They recognized that Roman law was a powerful tool for governance, far more detailed and comprehensive than their own traditional, customary laws, which were often focused on personal injury and tribal feud. The result was a fascinating legal synthesis. Germanic kings like the Visigothic king Alaric II commissioned the Breviary of Alaric, a simplified code of Roman law for his Roman subjects. The Frankish Salic law, while predominantly Germanic, shows clear Roman influence in its concepts of property and evidence. The most enduring legacy, however, came from the East. The monumental legal code, commissioned by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was a massive compilation and rationalization of 1,000 years of Roman legal history. While it had limited immediate impact in the chaotic West, its rediscovery in Italy in the 11th century was a watershed moment. Medieval scholars at the nascent university in Bologna began to study it intensely, and its principles of justice, equity, and reasoned argument became the foundation for the canon law of the Catholic Church and the civil law systems of nearly all of continental Europe. The very idea that society should be governed by a coherent, written legal system, rather than solely by the arbitrary will of a ruler, is a direct inheritance from Rome. The final and perhaps most precarious thread in this story of cultural continuity is the preservation of classical learning itself, As the urban centers of the West contracted and the economy simplified, the vast, secular literary culture of Rome was in grave danger. The works of poets, philosophers, historians, and scientists were written on papyrus and parchment, materials that decayed and required constant recopying to survive. In the West, it was the network of Christian monasteries that became the unexpected guardians of this pagan heritage. Within the silent scriptoriums of places like Monte Cassino in Italy or the monasteries of Ireland, monks dedicated their lives to copying manuscripts. Their primary mission was, of course, to copy the Bible, liturgical texts, and the writings of the Church Fathers, but they also copied the works of Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, and Livy. Why would pious Christians preserve the works of pagan authors? The answer is complex. Sometimes it was for their sheer literary beauty and mastery of the Latin language, which was also the language of their faith. Sometimes it was for grammatical instruction. And sometimes, as with the philosophy of Aristotle, it was to provide a logical framework for constructing Christian theology. These monasteries became islands of literacy in a sea of upheaval, and the classical texts they preserved were the essential seeds for the intellectual flowering of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This work of preservation was not a solo effort. While the West was consolidating, the torch of classical knowledge was also being carried forward in two other great civilizations. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, maintained an unbroken tradition of Greek and Roman learning. Byzantine scholars never stopped reading Plato and Aristotle, and they preserved vast libraries of ancient texts in the original Greek, texts that had been largely lost to the Latin West. Meanwhile, as the Islamic Caliphate expanded, it too became a crucial custodian of classical wisdom. In great centers of learning like Baghdad's House of Wisdom, teams of scholars translated the works of Greek philosophers, Roman physicians like Galen, and Indian mathematicians into Arabic. They didn't just preserve these texts, they expanded upon them, making groundbreaking advances in algebra, optics, and medicine that would later be retranslated into Latin and reintroduced to a Europe that was rediscovering its own past. A beautiful example of this cross-cultural journey is a manuscript like this one, a medieval copy of a Roman text on architecture, which might have been preserved in a monastery, influenced a Byzantine builder, and been studied by an Arab engineer before its ideas made their way back to the West. The story of classical learning is a global one, a relay race across continents and centuries where the baton of knowledge was passed from hand to hand, ensuring that the light of the ancient world was never fully extinguished. While the empire was grappling with external pressures and internal restructuring, a quieter, more insidious transformation was taking place in the very heart of Roman society, one driven by the calculated self-interest of its wealthiest and most powerful citizens. To understand this, we need to look past the emperors and generals and into the sprawling country estates of the late Roman aristocracy. Over the centuries, a profound shift had occurred. The old republican ideal of public service, where elite status was balanced by a duty to the state, had gradually withered away. In its place grew a culture of immense, and often ruthless, private accumulation. The senatorial class had become fantastically wealthy, and their primary objective was no longer the preservation of the Roman Empire as a whole, but the protection and expansion of their own personal fortunes and local influence, even if that meant slowly hollowing out the state that had created their privilege in the first place. The most damaging manifestation of this self-interest was a systemic and widespread evasion of the imperial tax burden. The late Roman state was a leviathan with endless expenses, a massive professional army, a sprawling bureaucracy, and the constant need for monumental building projects to maintain imperial prestige. All of this was funded by a complex and heavy tax system, primarily levied on land and its produce. However, the very individuals who had the most land and wealth were also the ones with the greatest power to avoid paying their share. A senator's vast estates, or latifundia, were often granted special immunities, or were simply too powerful for the imperial tax collector to assess properly. Local officials, who were often from the same landowning class, would look the other way or deliberately undervalue their neighbor's property. Imagine the entire tax system as a barrel meant to be filled with water to fund the state. The wealthy elite were not just taking smaller cups. They were drilling holes in the bottom of the barrel itself. The result was a catastrophic shortfall in revenue. The state, desperate for funds, was then forced to increase the tax burden on the one group that couldn't evade it: the small-scale farmers, the curial class in the towns, and the merchants. This crushed the middle tier of Roman society, driving many into debt and pushing them to seek the protection of the very same powerful landowners who were avoiding taxes, a cycle that only concentrated more wealth and power into fewer hands. This concentration of wealth created a new social and political reality. As these large landowners absorbed the failing farms of their neighbors, their private estates grew into semi-independent mini-kingdoms. A single senator's holdings might stretch across entire provinces, containing not just farmland, but also villages, workshops, and even private militias to protect them. These estates became virtually self-sufficient worlds, with their own economies, their own justice systems, and their own loyalties. The workers on these lands, known as coloni, were increasingly tied to the soil, foreshadowing the serfdom of the Middle Ages. Their primary allegiance was to the local lord who protected them and gave them land to work, not to a distant emperor in Ravenna or Constantinople, whom they never saw and who only seemed to demand taxes. This was a profound fragmentation of political loyalty. The empire was ceasing to be a single, unified political community, and was instead becoming a patchwork of powerful, private fiefdoms, each looking out for its own interests first. The central government's authority was slowly leaking away, not just at the borders, but in the very countryside it was supposed to control. This mindset of localism and self-preservation reached its logical, and for the empire its most fatal, conclusion when powerful barbarian groups began to settle permanently within the imperial borders. Faced with the choice between loyalty to a weak and financially draining central government, or making a pragmatic deal with the new, militarily powerful arrivals, the local Roman elites overwhelmingly chose the latter. Their calculus was simple and coldly rational. Why pour resources into defending an emperor who might be overthrown next year, when you could negotiate directly with the Gothic king or Frankish chieftain, now camped outside your city? These were not acts of treason in the traditional sense. They were business transactions designed to preserve the one thing that truly mattered: their own status and property. A provincial governor or a powerful bishop would often open the city gates to an invading force, not after a heroic siege, but after securing a private agreement that his lands, his title, and his authority over the local population would be respected by the new rulers. The barbarian leaders, for their part, were often eager to make these deals. They needed the administrative expertise of the Roman elite to govern the vast, tax-paying populations they now controlled. They needed someone who knew how to run a census, collect taxes in grain, and manage the complex legal system. We can see this process clearly in the seamless transition of power in 5th century Gaul. A Roman aristocrat like Sidonius Apollinaris, a senator, poet, and later bishop of Clermont, lived through the dissolution of imperial authority in the West. His letters provide a fascinating window into this world. He lamented the decline of Roman order, yet he also cultivated relationships with the new Visigothic and Burgundian kings, who now ruled large parts of Gaul. He wrote panegyrics praising them, and in return they confirmed his status and his authority. His family and thousands like it did not flee or fight to the last man. They adapted. They intermarried with the new Germanic nobility, blending Roman lineage with barbarian martial prestige. The son of a Roman senator might become a count in the Frankish kingdom, ruling over the same lands his father had, but now with a new title and a new master. The fundamental structures of local power, the large estate, the control of the peasantry, the social hierarchy remained intact. The central imperial administration in Ravenna simply became irrelevant to this local arrangement. The empire didn't so much fall as it was made redundant by its own elite, who found they could cut a better deal locally than they could by remaining loyal to a failing central state. The final deposition of the last Western emperor was, in many ways, just the formal recognition of a reality that had already taken root in the provinces. The loyalty of the powerful had been successfully transferred, and the empire as a unified political project was no longer worth saving in their eyes. To understand the real economic pressures reshaping the Roman world, we need to look closely at one of the most intimate and widespread artifacts of daily life, the coin. This wasn't a simple story of inflation. It was a slow-motion monetary unraveling that played out differently in the empire's two halves, ultimately creating entirely separate economic destinies. The Roman monetary system was a complex, three-tiered structure, almost like a modern economy with its different forms of currency. At the very top was the gold coin, the solidus, introduced by Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. This was the heavyweight champion of currencies. Struck at 72 to the Roman pound of pure gold, the solidus was incredibly stable and universally trusted. It was the currency of international trade, used to pay the army's higher ranks, and the preferred method for large-scale state transactions and hoarding wealth. Its value was so reliable that it became the dollar of the ancient world, circulating from Britain to India for nearly 1,000 years. Holding a solidus was like holding a piece of the empire's enduring power. Beneath this gold standard was the traditional backbone of Roman commerce, the silver coinage. For centuries, the silver denarius had been the workhorse of the Roman economy. The coin a legionary would be paid with and used to buy his daily bread. But over time, a silent crisis consumed this layer of the system. To fund its endless wars and massive bureaucracy without raising taxes to politically explosive levels, the state resorted to a hidden form of taxation: debasement. Emperors would systematically reduce the silver content in the coins, mixing in more and more copper, while insisting they still had the same face value. Imagine a government today secretly cutting a dollar bill with 50 cents worth of paper, and still demanding you accept it as a full dollar. You can see the visual evidence right here. Compare a bright, high silver denarius from the reign of Augustus in the 1st century to a dull, coppery one from the 3rd century. The later coin is a pale ghost of its ancestor. This practice was a short-term fix that created long-term chaos, as the public quickly lost faith in the coin's real value. At the very bottom of the pyramid were the bronze and copper coins, the nummus and follies. These were the true coins of the common people, used for everyday purchases in the marketplace: a loaf of bread, a measure of wine, a piece of cloth. This is where the monetary collapse hit hardest. As the government debased the silver coinage to fund its expenses, the value of these small change coins plummeted. The state was essentially printing money to cover its bills, leading to what we would now recognize as hyperinflation. Historical records and price edicts show the cost of everyday goods soaring. A measure of wheat that cost a handful of coins in the 2nd century might require a wheelbarrow full of them by the 4th. This wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was a social catastrophe that eroded the savings of the poor and the middle class, making it nearly impossible to plan for the future or engage in reliable commerce. This monetary decay did not affect the eastern and western halves of the empire equally. And here lies the crucial divergence. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, had a massive advantage: direct access to the gold mines of the Balkans, and more importantly, a favorable balance of trade. The East was the terminus of the Silk Road. Spices, silks, gems, and other luxuries flowed from Asia into its ports, and in return a steady stream of gold solidi flowed eastward to pay for them. This created a constant influx of gold bullion into the imperial treasury, allowing the Eastern emperors to maintain the solidus at its legendary purity and stability. The Eastern economy, anchored by this sound gold currency, remained robust and financially credible for centuries. Its monetary system was a fortress, and this financial strength was a key reason the Eastern Empire could weather crises that would break the West. The Western Empire faced the opposite problem: a critical and chronic shortage of precious metal. Its provinces Gaul, Britain, Spain, and Italy were less urbanized and lacked major gold mines. Furthermore, the West was often a net importer of goods, meaning more gold flowed out to pay for Eastern luxuries and to subsidize the Eastern army than flowed in. This created a debilitating bullion drain. The Western emperors in cities like Ravenna simply did not have enough gold to pay their armies and bureaucrats entirely in reliable solidi. They were forced to rely more heavily on the already debased silver and bronze currencies. As you can see in this economic flow chart, gold steadily migrated eastward, leaving the West with a monetary base that was increasingly unstable and untrustworthy. The Western government's response was a testament to its desperation. They repeatedly re-tariffed and revalued the bronze coinage, officially declaring that old coins were now worth less, a process that only deepened public distrust and accelerated the economic fragmentation. Faced with a central government that could no longer provide a trustworthy medium of exchange, people and regions across the West did what they have always done in such circumstances. They started to create their own solutions. The sophisticated, unified monetary zone of the early empire began to shatter into smaller, more localized economic spheres. In a world where the official coinage was virtually worthless, people increasingly reverted to barter for local trade. A farmer might pay his taxes or settle a debt with a portion of his harvest, a pot of olive oil, or a length of cloth. The government itself acknowledged this reality by increasingly demanding taxes in kind, that is, in actual goods and produce rather than in unreliable coin. This wasn't a descent into primitivism. It was a pragmatic adaptation to a broken system. Long-distance trade didn't disappear, but it became riskier and more dependent on barter or the limited supply of trusted gold coins. This regionalism is powerfully visible in the archaeology of coin hordes. In Britain, after the Roman legions withdrew in the early 5th century, the import of new Roman coinage stopped almost entirely. People stopped using the low-value bronze coins for everyday life. Instead, they began to recycle existing Roman silver and gold coins, often clipping them into smaller pieces or melting them down to create jewelry or bullion, which was then used for high-value transactions by weight. They were effectively creating their own, unofficial metal-based economy. Meanwhile, in Gaul, the new Visigothic and Frankish kings who took power began to take the ultimate symbolic step. They started minting their own coins. But look closely at these early Germanic coins. They are not crude imitations. They are direct copies of late Roman bronze and silver coins, often still bearing the portrait of a Roman emperor, sometimes with the name of their own king clumsily added in the margin. This was a powerful statement. These new rulers understood that economic legitimacy was still tied to the image of Rome. They weren't overthrowing the Roman monetary idea. They were stepping into its shoes, attempting to provide the stable currency that the Western emperors in Ravenna no longer could. The monetary fragmentation of the West was not a single event, but a drawn-out process of creative, local survival. A clear signal that the economic unity of the Roman Mediterranean was giving way to the more segmented, self-reliant economies of medieval Europe. To truly grasp the immense forces reshaping the Roman world, we need to pull our perspective back, far back, to a vantage point high above the Eurasian steppe. The movements of Gothic tribes across the Danube or Vandal hordes through Gaul were not isolated events. They were individual ripples in a vast, continent-wide wave, a domino effect of human displacement set in motion hundreds of miles to the east. The story of Rome's transformation is inextricably linked to a much larger drama. The era of the Great Migrations, a period of profound upheaval where entire peoples were set in motion, pressed westward by a power that seemed to erupt from the very edges of the known world. At the heart of this chain reaction were the Huns, a confederation of nomadic pastoralists from the vast grasslands of Central Asia. For the settled civilizations of Europe and the Middle East, their sudden appearance in the late 4th century was nothing short of apocalyptic. Roman historians, who had never seen anything like them, described them as monstrous subhumans, barely recognizable as a people. They were said to be short and stocky, to live and eat and even sleep on their horses, and to fight with a terrifying ferocity. While these descriptions are certainly exaggerated by fear and prejudice, they capture the sheer psychological shock the Huns delivered. Their mastery of horse archery was unparalleled. They could unleash a storm of arrows from a full gallop, using the powerful composite bow, a weapon of laminated wood, sinew, and horn that could punch through armor at an incredible distance. Their tactics were not about set-piece battles. They were about lightning speed, psychological terror, and overwhelming, disorienting violence. They were a whirlwind of destruction, and they were moving relentlessly westward. The first and most catastrophic impact of this Hunnic pressure was felt not by the Romans directly, but by the Gothic peoples living north of the Black Sea, in the region the Romans called Scythia. The Ostrogoths, or Greying Goths, and the Visigoths, the Glorious Goths, were not primitive savages. They were sophisticated tribal confederations with their own kings, a tradition of oral law, and a society organized for war and agriculture. They had coexisted, traded with, and occasionally raided the Roman Empire for generations. But when the Hunnic storm broke upon them in the year 376, their world was utterly shattered. The Huns defeated the Ostrogoths, subjugating them and absorbing their warriors into their own ever-growing horde. The Visigoths, witnessing the fate of their kin, faced an impossible choice: be conquered and enslaved by the Huns, or flee with everything they had into the one place that might offer safety, the Roman Empire. This is the crucial context that transforms the word invasion into something far more poignant and accurate: a desperate refugee crisis. The Visigoths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, did not approach the Danube River as an army of conquest. They arrived as a terrified multitude, men, women, children, and their entire herds of livestock, and begged the Eastern Roman Emperor, Valens, for asylum. They pleaded to be allowed to cross the river and settle on Roman soil as allies, promising to defend this new frontier in exchange for land and food. Valens, seeing an opportunity to gain thousands of new soldiers and farmers for his underpopulated provinces, agreed. But what followed was a tragic lesson in administrative failure and humanitarian disaster. The Roman officials tasked with processing the refugees were corrupt and cruel. They exploited the Goths' desperation, extorting them for food, and even forcing them to trade their children into slavery for morsels of dog meat. The situation, born of desperation, quickly spiraled into violence. Feeling betrayed and facing starvation, the Visigoths rose in revolt. This wasn't a planned invasion. It was a rebellion of desperate refugees. And it culminated in one of the most shocking defeats in Roman history. The Battle of Adrianople in 378, where the Visigoth cavalry annihilated the Roman legions and killed Emperor Valens himself. The gates of the empire, open to a people in need, had been blown off their hinges by a combination of Hunnic terror and Roman incompetence. This initial tremor set off a cascade of movement that would continue for over a century, a process you can see unfolding in this animated map. As the Hunnic Empire, under legendary leaders like Attila, consolidated its power in Central Europe, it acted like a giant boot, kicking one tribe after another into the fragile Roman frontier. The map shows how the Visigoths, after Adrianople, moved like a slow, destructive river through the Balkans, into Italy, and eventually into southern Gaul and Spain. The Vandals, along with the Alans and Suebi, were pushed across the frozen Rhine into Gaul on the last day of the year 406, a date that marked a point of no return. They then marched in a long, grueling trek through Gaul and into Spain, before the Vandals and Alans famously crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to carve out a kingdom in Roman North Africa. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes began crossing the sea to Britain as Roman authority there crumbled, and the Franks and Burgundians pressed deeper into Gaul. Each of these arrows on the map represents not just an army, but the migration of an entire people, a folk wandering with all the chaos, violence and yearning for stability that such a movement entails. It is vital to understand that these groups were not a unified force. They were often rivals and enemies, both with each other and with the Romans. The Visigoths fought for the Romans as federated troops, and they also fought against them. They fought the Vandals, and they fought the Huns. The political landscape of the late Roman West became an incredibly complex chessboard of shifting alliances, where a Roman general might lead an army of Goths and Huns to fight a Roman rebel backed by a different group of Franks. The barbarians were not a monolith, and the Romans were far from a unified bloc. The real story is one of negotiation, alliance, betrayal, and a constant, desperate search for a place to call home amid the collapsing order of the ancient world. The Roman Empire did not simply face an invasion. It was caught in a continent-wide reorganization of peoples, a turbulent and often tragic process of finding a new equilibrium that would ultimately lay the ethnic and political foundations for the Europe we know today. One of the most persistent myths about the fall of Rome is that its core institutions were wiped out, vanishing into the ether along with the last emperor in the West. But if you had walked into the city of Rome itself in the year 500, or even 600, you would have witnessed a scene that completely defies this narrative. In the grand, echoing chamber of the Curia Julia, the Senate house in the Roman Forum, the senators of Rome were still meeting. They still wore their distinctive striped togas, they still debated matters of state, and they still issued decrees. The Senate, that most ancient and venerable body, the very soul of the Roman Republic, did not dissolve in 476. It persisted, adapting and negotiating its survival for over a century, proving that the political collapse at the top was not the same as the extinction of a civilization's governing class. This enduring power wasn't rooted in military force, but in something even more fundamental: immense, unshakable wealth and deep-seated social prestige. The great senatorial families of Rome, the Aniciae, the Symachi, the Bothii, had not packed their bags and fled. They remained in their sprawling urban palaces on the Palatine Hill and continued to manage their vast, tax-exempt country estates, the latifundia, that stretched across Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. Their fortunes were not tied to the fluctuating fate of a distant emperor in Ravenna or Constantinople. They were built on land, the most durable form of wealth in the ancient world. A single senatorial household might control thousands of acres, entire villages of tied laborers known as coloni, and private militias for protection. They were, in effect, the de facto rulers of their own mini-kingdoms, and their primary loyalty was not to the abstract idea of an empire, but to the preservation of their own dynastic power and privilege. This gave them a powerful negotiating position with any new ruler who aspired to control Italy. When Odoacer took control in 476, and later when the Ostrogothic king Theodoric established his rule in 403, they faced a simple, pragmatic reality. They were military commanders with a few tens of thousands of Gothic warriors. They could not possibly hope to administer the complex, ancient bureaucracy of Italy, with its intricate tax rolls, legal system, and urban administrations, using only their own tribal followers. They needed the Senate. The new Germanic rulers understood that to govern effectively and legitimize their rule in the eyes of the millions of Romans they now ruled, they had to co-opt the existing power structure. So they didn't dismantle it, they partnered with it. Theodoric, in particular, was a master of this political theater. He ruled from Ravenna, but he treated the Roman Senate with elaborate public respect. He confirmed the senators in their traditional privileges, consulted them on matters of law and policy, and appointed them to the highest civilian offices, such as the prestigious consulship and the powerful role of Praetorian Prefect of Italy. The career of a man like Cassiodorus is a perfect illustration of this seamless continuity. Born into a distinguished senatorial family, Cassiodorus served as a high-ranking official under Theodoric and his successors. His extensive writings, his Variae, are a collection of official letters and documents that provide a breathtaking window into this hybrid world. In these letters, we see a Roman aristocrat, writing in flawless Latin, drafting edicts in the name of his Ostrogothic king. He speaks of Theodoric as a rightful ruler who upholds Roman law, maintains the aqueducts and public buildings, and preserves the peace. Cassiodorus wasn't a traitor to Rome. In his own mind, he was serving it, ensuring that the machinery of Roman civilization continued to function smoothly under new management. His life's work demonstrates that the administrative expertise of the Roman senatorial class was not just valuable to the new rulers, it was utterly indispensable. The state apparatus kept running because the same people who had always run it were still at their posts, simply reporting to a different sovereign. The physical, archaeological evidence from this period powerfully confirms this continuity, and even reveals a lingering cultural struggle. For generations, the Senate house in the Forum had contained a small, secret shrine known as the Caesalum. Within this sacred space stood a golden statue of the goddess Victory, a potent symbol of Rome's eternal power. Throughout the late 4th century, as Christianity became dominant, there were fierce debates between powerful Christian bishops and staunchly pagan senators over the removal of this statue. The written records, largely from the Christian perspective, suggest it was eventually taken away. However, archaeology tells a more nuanced story. Excavations have shown that the Caesalum remained intact and in use for much longer than previously thought. It seems the pagan traditionalists within the Senate managed to preserve their most cherished symbol, or a version of it, for decades, perhaps even generations, after the empire had officially become Christian. This isn't just a detail about religion. It's proof of the Senate's enduring political clout. They were powerful enough to resist the demands of the Church and maintain their ancient traditions within the very heart of Roman political life, long after the imperial court had embraced a new faith. This long twilight of the Senate didn't last forever, of course. The devastating Gothic War between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Ostrogoths in the 6th century wreaked havoc on Italy, destroying its economy and decimating its population. The final blow to the old senatorial aristocracy likely came not from a barbarian king, but from the Emperor Justinian's reconquest and the subsequent Lombard invasions that fractured Italy for good. Yet, even as the institution itself gradually faded, the senatorial families did not simply vanish. They transformed, just as the empire had. Many intermarried with the new Gothic and later Lombard nobility, blending their prestigious Roman lineage with the martial authority of the new rulers. Others channeled their wealth and education into the one institution that was growing even stronger, the Christian Church. It became increasingly common for the sons and daughters of senatorial families to become bishops, abbots, and abbesses, positions that carried immense temporal power and influence in the early Middle Ages. The legacy of the Senate lived on in the medieval aristocracy and the papal curia, its administrative DNA woven into the fabric of a new world. The story of the Senate's endurance is a powerful testament to the fact that while political systems can be overthrown, the deep-rooted social and economic structures of a civilization are far more resilient, capable of bending and adapting to ensure their own survival across centuries of profound change. But this reorganization of power and economy reached far beyond the city walls, transforming the very landscape that fed the empire. For centuries, the agricultural engine of Rome had been the large-scale plantation, the latifundia, vast estates, often owned by absentee aristocrats, and worked by enslaved labor, producing cash crops like grain and olive oil for the urban masses, and for export across the Mediterranean. This was a system of remarkable efficiency and scale, but it was also incredibly fragile, dependent on stable climate, secure transport routes, and a massive, controlled labor force. As the world of the 5th and 6th centuries grew more unstable, this system didn't just collapse. It underwent a profound and necessary metamorphosis, adapting to a new reality of localized needs and diminished resources. The driving forces behind this shift were a powerful combination of environmental change and human crisis. We've already seen how the volcanic winters of the mid-6th century led to catastrophic crop failures, but the broader climatic trend was one of cooling and increased unpredictability, making the old, specialized farming for a distant market far too risky. At the same time, the repeated pandemics, particularly the Justinianic plague, delivered a hammer blow to the labor force. There simply weren't enough people left to work the sprawling plantations in the old, intensive way. The immense gangs of enslaved workers that had once fueled the latifundia became a thing of the past, not through a sudden moral awakening, but through sheer demographic catastrophe. Furthermore, the disintegration of long-distance trade and the constant threat of raids made large-scale production for export a fool's errand. Why grow a massive surplus of grain if you couldn't safely transport it to a market, or if marauders were likely to seize it? The economic logic that had sustained the classical agricultural model was breaking down. The response to these pressures wasn't chaos. It was a strategic retreat into self-sufficiency. The agricultural landscape began to look very different, a change you can vividly see in these landscape reconstruction visuals. The vast, open fields of the latifundia, dedicated to a single crop, gradually gave way to a more varied and resilient patchwork. Farmers shifted from high-risk, single-crop agriculture to a mixed farming approach. Instead of endless wheat, a typical farm would now have a smaller grain plot, a vegetable garden, a few fruit trees, and some livestock: sheep for wool, pigs for meat, and oxen for ploughing. This diversified system was less productive in terms of sheer surplus for the state, but it was far more robust. If one crop failed, others might succeed. It was an agriculture designed not for profit and export, but for survival and local consumption. The very definition of a successful farm was changing from one that generated cash to one that reliably fed a household and its immediate community. This new reality is perfectly embodied in the physical evolution of the Roman villa. Picture the classic villa of the early empire. A sprawling, luxurious country house with colonnaded courtyards, elaborate mosaic floors, and separate, often grim, barracks for the enslaved workers. It was a statement of wealth and a command center for a large-scale agricultural business. Now look at the transformation over the centuries. As you can see in this visual reconstruction, the late Roman villa begins to change. The luxurious residential quarters often contract or are fortified. The outbuildings, the granaries, the workshops, the barns, become more central. The villa complex starts to look less like a palace and more like a fortified hamlet, a self-contained economic unit. This was the birthplace of the medieval manor. The landowner was no longer an absentee senator in Rome, but a local lord who lived on the estate, and the workforce was no longer composed of enslaved people in chains, but of colony tenant farmers who were legally free but increasingly tied to the land they worked, owing a share of their harvest and labor services to the landowner in exchange for protection and the right to farm their own plots. This system, the precursor to serfdom, was not a descent into barbarism. It was a pragmatic and logical adaptation to a world without a strong central state to guarantee security, or a functioning monetary economy to facilitate wage labor. For the landowner, it ensured a stable resident workforce that could defend the estate and provide a predictable food supply. For the colonists, it offered protection from bandits and rival warlords, and a guaranteed stake in the land. It was a localized bargain that replaced the impersonal, cash-based relationships of the imperial economy. The walls built around these evolving villa complexes weren't just for defense. They were a symbol of this new, inward-looking social contract. The estate was becoming its own world, a cell in the body of a new society, and its primary focus was no longer feeding distant cities, but sustaining itself and its immediate lord. The Roman agricultural world didn't vanish. It ruralized, turning inward and focusing on local resilience, laying the groundwork for the manorial economy that would define the European countryside for the next 1,000 years. And so we arrive at the nervous system of the empire itself, not the legions or the emperors, but the intricate web of roads, sea lanes, and imperial messengers that bound this colossal state together. For centuries, the speed and reliability of Roman communications were a strategic advantage unmatched by any other civilization. An imperial edict could travel from Britain to Egypt. A letter could find its recipient hundreds of miles away, and troops could be summoned to a crisis point with a precision that kept rivals perpetually off balance. This system was the empire's circulatory system, and when it began to falter, the entire body politic started to suffer from a kind of creeping paralysis. The challenge wasn't a sudden severing of these lines, but a gradual, insidious degradation. A slow-motion breakdown that made the very act of governing an empire of such scale an exercise in mounting frustration and delay. To understand the sheer miracle of Roman communications at their peak, consider the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service. This wasn't a mail service for the public. It was a state-funded, high-speed logistics network reserved for government business, moving officials, military dispatches, and tax revenues. At its heart were relay stations spaced a day's journey apart, each stocked with fresh horses, carriages and dedicated couriers. A message could travel up to 50 miles in a single day, an astonishing speed in the ancient world. This system allowed an emperor in Rome to have a reasonably current understanding of events on the Rhine frontier or in the Syrian deserts. But this network was phenomenally expensive to maintain. It required a massive, uninterrupted flow of funds to pay for the horses, the grooms, the station masters, and the feed. It depended on peace and security along thousands of miles of road. And as the 3rd and 4th centuries wore on, that security and that funding became increasingly uncertain. Banditry became more common, local officials tasked with maintaining the stations grew corrupt or impoverished, and the constant civil wars meant that the cursus publicus was often commandeered by rival factions, disrupting its official function. The system didn't vanish overnight, but it became slower, less reliable, and far more vulnerable. This degradation had a direct and crippling impact on military and political coordination. Imagine you are a provincial governor in 5th century Gaul. A new band of raiders has crossed the Rhine and is pillaging the countryside. In the 2nd century, you would have dispatched a courier to the nearest legionary command, and reinforcements might arrive within weeks. Now your courier might be ambushed, or the road might be controlled by a local warlord who doesn't recognize your authority. The message takes months to reach a central authority, if it arrives at all. By the time a response is formulated and an order is sent back, the crisis has either burned itself out or escalated beyond control. The empire was losing its ability to react in real time. This map vividly illustrates the shrinking of effective communication zones over time. Notice how the thick, bold lines representing major, secure routes in the 2nd century begin to thin and fragment by the 5th. The unified network of the early empire gives way to a patchwork of regional clusters. A message could still travel from Constantinople to Ravenna by sea, but land routes through the Balkans became perilous. Communication between Britain and the continent became sporadic, then virtually ceased. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake facilitating easy maritime contact, was now increasingly plagued by pirates and Vandal corsairs based in North Africa, who could intercept shipping at will. The empire was literally losing touch with itself. Faced with this reality, provinces and cities had no choice but to look inward. This growing localism wasn't an act of secession or rebellion. It was a pragmatic, necessary adaptation for survival. When you can't rely on the imperial army to protect you, you raise your own militia. When you can't depend on grain shipments from Egypt or Africa to feed your city, you focus on growing food in your immediate hinterland. When the imperial tax collector stops coming because the route is too dangerous, you use those resources to fortify your own walls. The sophisticated, interdependent economy of the early empire, where Spanish olive oil was traded for British tin and Syrian glass, gradually fractured into smaller, more self-sufficient regional economies. A city in Gaul began producing its own pottery instead of importing fineware from Italy. A town in Spain sourced its metals locally rather than waiting for shipments from distant mines. This shift is starkly visible in the archaeological record, where the wide distribution of certain pottery types suddenly contracts, replaced by local styles and manufactures. This fragmentation fundamentally rewired the political loyalties of the average person. For centuries, a Roman citizen's identity was tied to the larger idea of Romanitas, the shared culture, law, and civilization of the empire. But as the lines of communication broke down, that sense of a shared destiny began to weaken. Why should a farmer in northern Gaul feel loyalty to an emperor in Ravenna whom he has never seen, who cannot protect him from local raiders, and whose tax demands feel like an extraction for a service no longer rendered? His world shrank to the horizon of his own valley, his own city, and the local landowner or bishop who could actually provide security and justice. The powerful sense of being part of a world-spanning civilization was replaced by the more immediate concerns of local identity and local power. The empire didn't just contract administratively. It contracted psychologically, as people's spheres of concern and allegiance narrowed to what was visible and manageable. The slow death of the imperial communication network wasn't just a logistical failure. It was the quiet unraveling of the shared consciousness that had once made Rome more than just a collection of conquered provinces. This chronic instability created a devastating cycle that bled the empire dry from the inside out. Every time a general marched on Rome to claim the purple, he had to pay his army, and that army grew accustomed to generous donatives, massive cash bonuses for their support. This turned the legions from a professional fighting force into a kind of political auction house, where the throne went to the commander who could promise the most gold. The state treasury, which should have been funding border defenses, aqueduct maintenance, and grain supplies for the cities, was instead being siphoned into the pockets of soldiers to keep a particular emperor in power for a few more months. Furthermore, these constant civil wars were not bloodless political contests. They were full-scale military conflicts that ravaged the empire's most prosperous provinces. The fighting often took place not on the frontier, but in the heartland of Italy, Gaul, and the Balkans, destroying farmland, disrupting trade routes, and depopulating entire regions. While the Roman army was busy fighting itself, the empire's actual enemies watched from the sidelines, seeing a distracted and weakened giant. Germanic tribes grew bolder in their raids across the Rhine and Danube, knowing that the legions stationed there might be miles away, battling a rival Roman claimant. The Persian Empire in the east would seize the opportunity to launch invasions, capturing key cities and territories, while the Roman military was preoccupied with its internal power struggles. The empire's attention and resources were perpetually turned inward, like a body so focused on fighting a fever that it fails to notice the gangrene spreading in its limbs. This internal focus meant that broader systemic challenges, the economic strains, the need for administrative reform, the long-term demographic shifts were simply never addressed with any consistency. An emperor who ruled for only a few months had no time to implement a coherent policy. He was in a constant state of political survival, putting out immediate fires while the entire structure slowly smoldered around him. The leadership crisis of the 3rd century didn't just cause political chaos. It actively prevented the empire from mounting a coordinated and effective response to the other immense pressures it was facing, creating a perfect storm where every problem fed into and amplified the others. Yet even as Christianity rose to become the state religion, it brought with it a new source of conflict that tore at the empire's social fabric from within. We often picture a simple struggle between a unified Christian faith and a fading paganism, but the reality was far more divisive. The most damaging religious battles of the late Roman world were not between Christians and pagans, but between Christians and other Christians. These were not merely academic debates held by robed theologians in dusty libraries. They were passionate, often violent disputes over the fundamental nature of God and salvation that spilled into city streets, divided families, and even sparked civil unrest, creating deep social fractures at a time when the empire could least afford them. One of the most profound and enduring of these conflicts was the struggle between the followers of the Nicene Creed and those who subscribed to Arianism. The core of the dispute was staggeringly complex, centering on the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son. The Nicene position, which would eventually become Orthodox Catholic doctrine, held that the Father and the Son were of the same substance, co-equal and co-eternal. The Arian view, named after the priest Arius, argued that the Son was a created being, of similar substance to the Father, but distinct and subordinate. To the modern ear, this might sound like an arcane argument over semantics, but in the 4th and 5th centuries, it was a matter of eternal consequence that gripped the entire empire. The stakes were perceived as nothing less than the correct path to salvation. This theological rift was not contained within the Church. It became a political and ethnic fault line. After the Council of Nicaea in 325 condemned Arianism, the doctrine found a second life among many of the Germanic tribes, particularly the Goths and Vandals, through the missionary work of Bishop Ulfilas. He translated the Bible into the Gothic language and spread the Arian version of the faith. This meant that when these Germanic peoples entered the empire as foederati or conquerors, they were not just cultural outsiders. They were heretics in the eyes of the majority Catholic Roman population. The Gothic king in Italy, or the Vandal king in North Africa, was not only a different ethnic ruler, but the leader of a rival church. This religious difference made assimilation far more difficult, and added a layer of righteous intolerance to what were already tense political relationships. The art from this period reflects this division. In Arian contexts, like this 6th century mosaic from an Arian baptistry in Ravenna, depictions of Christ often emphasize his humanity and his role as a divinely appointed king, reflecting the Arian view of him as a created being. In contrast, contemporary Nicene art from the same city, just a short walk away, portrays a more majestic, eternal Christ, co-equal with the Father, highlighting the stark visual and theological gulf between the two communities living side by side. Meanwhile, in the prosperous provinces of North Africa, a different kind of Christian controversy was eroding the authority of the imperial church, the Donatist schism. This conflict had its roots in the great persecution under Emperor Diocletian, when some Christian bishops had handed over holy scriptures to Roman authorities to be burned, earning them the label traditors, those who had handed over the faith. Once the persecution ended, a rigorous faction led by the Bishop Donatus argued that any sacraments, like baptism, performed by these supposedly tainted priests were invalid. They believed the Church must be a pure body of spotless saints, and that compromise with the state during persecution had permanently corrupted the official Church hierarchy. The opposing, more pragmatic view, which became the Catholic position, held that the efficacy of a sacrament depended on God's grace, not the moral purity of the priest administering it. This was not just a theological disagreement, it was a social revolution. Donatism became the faith of the native Berber population and the rural poor in North Africa, a vehicle for regional identity and resistance against the landowning elite and the imperial authorities in Rome, who supported the Catholic Church. Donatist radicals, known as circumcellions, roamed the countryside, attacking the estates of the wealthy Catholic aristocracy in what was essentially a class and religious war rolled into one. For over a century, emperors sent troops, imposed fines, and held debates, all failing to stamp out the Donatist Church, which maintained its own parallel hierarchy of bishops and its own vibrant liturgical life. The energy and resources the Roman state poured into fighting this internal Christian civil war in a key grain-producing province were immense, diverting attention and military force away from the empire's external defenses and deepening social resentments that would make the Vandal conquest of North Africa decades later far easier. These internal divisions had a corrosive effect that went far beyond theology. They shattered the ideal of a unified Romanitas, a common Roman identity that could bind the empire's diverse peoples together. When your neighbor, who speaks your language and lives under the same laws, is a heretic you believe is destined for damnation, the bonds of civic trust and cooperation begin to dissolve. Religious affiliation started to map onto political loyalty. An Arian Goth might be less inclined to obey a Catholic Roman emperor, and a Catholic Roman senator might be more willing to negotiate with a foreign power if it meant suppressing a local Donatist rival. The imperial government, by attempting to enforce religious uniformity through councils and imperial decrees, often ended up deepening these divisions, making the state itself a party to theological disputes and alienating large segments of its own population. The Church, which could have been a unifying force in a fragmenting world, was instead often a source of bitter conflict. It created parallel societies within the empire, each with its own leadership, its own networks of patronage, and its own sense of righteousness. This internal fracturing meant that when the political structure of the Western Empire finally dissolved, there was no single, cohesive cultural or religious institution left that could hold the entire edifice together. The social cohesion necessary for a vast, centralized state had been profoundly weakened, not by external enemies, but by the very faith that had come to define the empire's new spiritual life. So why did the East survive and even flourish for another 1,000 years, while the West underwent its profound transformation? The answer lies not in a single secret weapon, but in a powerful combination of geographic, economic, and political advantages that the Eastern Empire shrewdly leveraged. Constantinople itself was the cornerstone of this endurance. The city was a fortress without equal in the ancient world. Look at its position on this map, situated on a triangular peninsula, protected on two sides by the sea, and on the landward side by the monumental Theodosian walls, a complex system of inner and outer walls with a water-filled moat and nearly 200 towers. These defenses were so advanced that they would remain virtually impregnable until the invention of gunpowder cannon. Compare this to the city of Rome, which, despite its symbolic Aurelian walls, was situated on open, accessible plains and had long been vulnerable to any army that could march into Italy. But the East's advantage was more than just stone and mortar. Its economic foundation was far broader and more resilient. The eastern provinces Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt were the ancient, densely populated, and urbanized heartlands of the classical world. They had been wealthy for centuries, before Rome even existed. This region controlled the terminus of the Silk Road, meaning a constant flow of gold and silver from the west came east to pay for silks, spices, and luxuries, creating a favorable balance of trade that kept the imperial treasury in Constantinople flush with the one thing the West desperately lacked: hard currency, specifically the pure gold solidus. This economic strength allowed the Eastern emperors to maintain a large, professional, and, crucially, salaried army, whose loyalty was bought and maintained with reliable pay, not promises of land. This financial stability translated directly into more consistent and effective leadership. While the Western throne became a revolving door for puppets and generals, the Eastern imperial office, though not without its own dramas and coups, demonstrated remarkable dynastic stability. Long-reigning emperors like Theodosius II, who ruled for over 40 years, and later Leo I and Anastasius, provided the continuity needed for long-term planning. They weren't constantly looking over their shoulders at a rival army marching on their capital, allowing them to implement coherent fiscal and foreign policies that spanned decades. This stable leadership also mastered a critical diplomatic skill that their Western counterparts often fumbled: the sophisticated management of barbarian groups. The Eastern emperors learned a brutal lesson from the Western experience with the Visigoths. They saw how a refugee crisis, mishandled through corruption and incompetence, could spiral into a military disaster like the Battle of Adrianople. So they adopted a far more calculated and divisive strategy. Instead of allowing a single large tribal confederation to settle en masse within their heartland, they expertly played one group against another. They would pay the Huns massive subsidies of gold to attack the Goths, then pay the Goths to fight the Huns. They would grant one group feudatory status on a distant frontier, while encouraging a rival group to settle in the territory of their enemies. This policy of divide and rule prevented any one barbarian power from becoming strong enough to challenge the state itself. The Eastern Empire used its gold not just to pay its own armies, but to hire barbarian armies to fight its wars for it, keeping the main threat away from its core territories. Let's put their strategies side by side to see the stark contrast in approaches. In the West, when a large group like the Vandals or Visigoths demanded settlement, the response was often reactive and desperate. The Western government, financially strapped and militarily weak, would grant them huge swaths of territory, often the most productive tax-paying provinces like North Africa or southern Gaul. This was a catastrophic short-term fix that only accelerated the state's collapse. It transferred the very source of its wealth, land and taxpayers, out of its control and into the hands of autonomous, and often hostile, military powers. The Eastern approach was the opposite, proactive and strategic. They rarely, if ever, allowed a major barbarian group to settle in the wealthy provinces of Anatolia or Greece. Instead, they directed them westward, often into the already struggling Western Empire, or settled them in buffer zones along the Danube, where they could act as a first line of defense against the next wave of migrants. The West paid its foederati with land, a resource that once given was gone forever. The East paid its barbarian allies and mercenaries in gold, a resource it could, in theory, always replenish through taxation and trade. This kept the military power in the hands of those whose loyalty was to the gold, not to a specific patch of soil they now owned. The Eastern Empire essentially learned to outsource its frontier defense, using its economic might to turn potential invaders into paid border guards, a policy that preserved the integrity of its core territories and its centralized state power for centuries to come. This wasn't a matter of the East being inherently stronger or more virtuous. It was a testament to its ability to learn from the West's fatal mistakes and adapt its institutions to survive in a dangerous new world. But perhaps the most powerful challenge to the old story of catastrophic collapse comes not from dusty manuscripts, but from the ground itself. Archaeology provides a completely different kind of testimony, one that is silent, stubborn, and often brutally honest. While written accounts from the period are scarce and often reflect the perspectives of a literate, elite, and frequently panicked minority, the physical remains of everyday life tell a story of remarkable continuity and gradual adaptation. Excavations from Britain to Syria are forcing us to fundamentally rewrite the 5th and 6th centuries, revealing a world not of abrupt endings, but of persistent rhythms where the basic patterns of life, how people ate, built their homes, and farmed their land continued with a resilience that written sources completely miss. Consider the humble pottery sherd. For archaeologists, broken pieces of pottery are like buried history books. They are abundant, durable, and their styles change over time, allowing experts to date sites with incredible precision. The traditional fall of Rome narrative would suggest that the production of distinct, high-quality Roman pottery, like the fine red slipped terra sigillata that was mass-produced in Gaul and traded across the empire, simply stopped, replaced by crude, locally made alternatives. And on the surface, this seems true. The large industrial-scale potteries that produced these standardized wares did indeed shut down. But if you look at what replaces them, the story becomes far more interesting. Across former Roman provinces, people didn't forget how to make pots. Instead, local potters began producing their own versions, often imitating the familiar Roman shapes: the bowls, the jars, the cooking pots, but with local clays and decorative styles. The form was still recognizably Roman, but the production had become decentralized. This isn't evidence of a loss of knowledge or a descent into barbarism. It's evidence of an economy adapting. Communities were no longer reliant on a fragile, long-distance supply chain for their basic goods. They were making do for themselves, creating a new, more localized material culture that blended Roman tradition with emerging regional identities. The change was real, but it was evolutionary, not revolutionary. This pattern of quiet continuity is even more striking when we look at the landscape of agriculture and daily life. The image of abandoned villas being reclaimed by forest is a powerful one, and in some places it did happen. But in many more, the story is one of transformation, not abandonment. Excavations of post-Roman farmsteads in places like Gaul and Britain show that farmers did not stop cultivating the land. They continue to grow the same basic crops, wheat, barley, oats, and raise the same animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, that their Roman ancestors had. The agricultural knowledge, the very foundation of survival, was never lost. What changed was the social and economic structure surrounding it. The large, slave-run villa estate might have been subdivided, or its central building converted into a simpler, more practical farmhouse. The sophisticated irrigation systems might have fallen into disrepair, but the fields themselves were still being plowed. The archaeological evidence reveals a rural world that was still very much alive and working, just organized on a smaller, more community-focused scale. Life didn't stop. It simply recalibrated to a new, less centralized reality. Nowhere is the clash between the written word and physical evidence more dramatic than in the fate of Roman cities. Historians relying on texts would be forgiven for picturing 5th century urban centers as ghost towns, their forums empty and their buildings hollow ruins. But archaeology paints a much more nuanced and vibrant picture. Take the city of Wroxeter in Roman Britain. Written sources would tell you that Roman authority collapsed there in the early 5th century, implying the city was abandoned. However, extensive excavations have revealed something astonishing. Decades after the last Roman officials left, the people of Wroxeter were not only still living there, but they were engaged in large-scale, organized construction. They built a substantial timber structure, reusing the stone foundations of the old Roman basilica, maintaining it as a central public space for a generation or more. This wasn't a squatter camp. It was a community consciously repurposing its Roman inheritance for its own needs. Similarly, in cities like Cologne in Germany or Arles in France, archaeologists find that while the grand public baths and amphitheaters fell into disuse, the urban population didn't vanish. They clustered in newly fortified neighborhoods, and life continued within a more compact footprint. The evidence of continuous habitation, layers of domestic refuse, repaired roads, and modified buildings shows that the idea of the city never died. It was reshaped, its classical Roman form slowly morphing into its early medieval successor. Perhaps the most compelling archaeological testimony comes from the science of what people ate. Isotope analysis of human skeletons allows scientists to determine an individual's diet with remarkable accuracy. Studies of skeletons from burial sites in Britain, dating from the late Roman period into the so-called Dark Ages, have yielded a revolutionary finding. There was no sudden, dramatic shift in the diet of the general population. People continued to eat a similar mix of grains, vegetables, and animal proteins. There is little evidence of the widespread famine and nutritional collapse that a sudden societal breakdown would suggest. In fact, in some areas, the diet may have even improved for the average person, as the heavy tax burden in kind, which required peasants to hand over their best produce to the state, was lifted. The bones tell a story of biological continuity, a silent rebuttal to the tales of universal suffering and civilizational extinction. This physical evidence, drawn from the very bodies of the people who lived through this transition, forces us to see it not as a brutal catastrophe, but as a profound and gradual metamorphosis, where the underlying fabric of daily life proved far more durable than the political superstructure that had once governed it. So as we've journeyed through these complex centuries together, a very different picture has emerged from the one we're so often told. It's a picture not of a single dramatic crash, but of a profound and continuous metamorphosis. The Roman Empire didn't simply fall. It transformed, adapting over hundreds of years to a perfect storm of internal pressures and external shifts. The truth we've uncovered is that the political superstructure of the Western Empire, the imperial office in Ravenna, was just one layer of a much deeper and more resilient civilization. And when that political layer dissolved, the world beneath it didn't vanish. Instead, it slowly, creatively, and stubbornly rearranged itself into the foundations of medieval Europe and the enduring powerhouse of the Byzantine East. The light of Rome was never snuffed out. It was refracted, splitting into a spectrum of new cultures, kingdoms, and traditions that would shape the next 1,000 years of history. Think about all the elements we've seen that refused to disappear. The Roman roads remained the essential arteries of travel and trade for centuries. The Latin language didn't die. It evolved on the lips of common people into the Romance languages we know today, while its written form remained the language of law, faith, and scholarship. The vast country estates of the senatorial aristocracy didn't crumble into dust. They transformed into the self-sufficient manners of the medieval countryside, with the old Roman landowning class often simply changing their titles from senators to feudal lords. The church didn't abandon the cities. Its bishops stepped into the power vacuum, providing stability and preserving Roman administrative practices. And in the East, the Roman Empire didn't end in 476. It continued, vibrant and powerful, for another full millennium from its bastion in Constantinople, defending classical knowledge and Roman law until it could be rediscovered by the West. This was not a death. It was the most successful, large-scale reinvention in human history. This realization invites a much bigger question about how we view history itself. We are drawn to simple, dramatic stories: the bonfire, the battle, the single date that changes everything. The myth of Rome's fall is perhaps the most seductive of them all. But history in its true form is rarely so neat. It's a messy, complex, and gradual process, more about evolution than about revolution. The real story of Rome challenges us to look beyond the easy narrative of rise and fall, and to appreciate the incredible resilience of human institutions, the power of cultural adaptation, and the slow, powerful currents of economic and environmental change that truly shape our world. It teaches us that the end of one political system is not the end of a civilization, and that the most enduring legacies are often not the marble monuments, but the intangible foundations of law, language, and faith that can weather even the most turbulent transitions. Now we'd love to hear this spark a conversation with all of you. As you reflect on this journey through the transformation of the Roman world, what was the most surprising or fascinating revelation for you? Was it the realization that the barbarians were often integrated Roman commanders, not savage invaders? The idea that climate change and pandemic played such a decisive role? Or perhaps it was the sheer endurance of the Senate, meeting for generations after the last emperor was gone, Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue unraveling this incredible story together. Your perspective adds another vital piece to understanding this grand, ancient puzzle.